When people walk up to me and say, "What do you do?" and I say, "I'm a farmer," they said, "Where do you farm? Where's the land to farm?"
There are serious issues affecting this food system from where it comes from up to the shelf in the shop. And you can realize that there are powerful players far stronger than us.
Every human being has the right to have enough food. No one should go to bed hungry. What type of governance do we need, and how can we ensure that food production is done within planetary boundaries? This is the big challenge, but there are cross-cutting issues.
I think the direction of African agriculture should go to agroecology, because agroecology is not a tinkering agenda, it's a transformative agenda. And at the center of agroecology is also a right to food. Currently, only 2.7% of the support for agriculture from the European Union goes to agroecology.
L'Europe facilite l'exportation vers l'Afrique de ces productions agricoles lourdement subventionnées, et cela disqualifie ou réduit l'accès au marché des petits paysans africains qui ont de petites exploitations et qui ne peuvent pas compétir.
Our small-scale farming system aspiration should not be what we witness in Europe, and then because we know that the Europeans are locked in a system they cannot get out. We are not in that system. And then we do not want to move toward that system. And what the alternative?
Now, in Western Kenya, the land sizes are small. So that means that whatever space that a farmer has on the land then has to be used economically. So then along the contours, we also integrate bananas. We can also do the sweet potato. It has to be something that also benefits the farmer.
La restauration est une chance pour l'Afrique. Non seulement l'Afrique a 60% des terres arables non encore emblavées, mais l'Afrique a un tiers du potentiel mondial, à savoir 715 millions d'hectares de terres qui ont encore des terres dégradées qui peuvent encore être restaurées.
The good thing with the food systems approach is that we're not just talking about farmers. We're now talking about every actor, from the farm to the dining room table to the fork and knife that we use. And what I like about this discourse is that it now allows everybody to participate. And the best game for us to play is the policy development game.
We need land to grow our food, we need land to protect biodiversity, and we need land to mitigate against and adapt to climate change. But how can we ensure that those who do the bulk of these actions also have a fair share to these resources?
Finding responses to these questions requires an open dialogue. It further requires that we manage to establish new alliances, because still too many continue to protect the status quo. And together, this is our invitation to this dialogue series.
And here we are in the flesh. Welcome everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon from wherever you're joining us. We're really, really grateful that you have joined us for this exciting event. We believe we have a wonderful lineup of speakers, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you. So because I don't want to take too much time away from them, I'm just going to introduce my colleague here, my co-host, Yes Weichelt.
Hello.
And I'm Wangu Mwangi, and we will be moderating you through this event. So before I hand over to the first speaker, I will just quickly mention that you can join us. You can join us on the hashtag Land, Food, Climate, where you can pose your questions, you can interact with other speakers and other people that will be attending this event. And then you can also, in the comments button on your screen, you can also post your questions and comments. We'll be taking them throughout the whole discussion through this afternoon. So thanks again, and I will now invite Gerrit Hansen, who is the Director of Climate Change and Global Policies at Robert Bosch Foundation, to make an introductory remark. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Wangu, and thank you all for joining, and a very warm welcome to our guests, distinguished speakers and co-hosts. It is my pleasure to open this timely event on behalf of Robert Bosch Stiftung. The Robert Bosch Stiftung is one of the major foundations in Europe associated with a private company. Our task is to carry out the legacy of our founder, industrialist and humanitarian Robert Bosch, who was dedicated to promoting peace, stability, human dignity, and equal opportunities. Today, peaceful coexistence depends on finding answers to global challenges. The Foundation's international work focuses on pressing issues such as climate change and inequality, and is currently developing a focus on sub-Saharan Africa. Our climate portfolio is exclusively focused on land use, or to be more precise, on the climate, biodiversity, and food nexus, and a just transition to a climate and nature positive and more equitable world. The food system is central to our work as a driver of land use change and an essential factor for realizing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Still today, 1 in 10 people globally goes hungry. More than 50% of the African population is food insecure, meaning they cannot afford a healthy diet, have to skip meals, or occasionally go without food for an entire day. Food insecurity deprives humans of the opportunity to lead active lives and fully participate in society. Not having enough to eat is arguably the most extreme form of exclusion and vulnerability. Poverty and inequalities are the structural reasons underlying hunger and malnutrition, and the very same reasons that cause vulnerability to climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change just confirmed once more what science has been telling us for decades. Climate change is real, it's us, and it's accelerating. Global warming already causes great harm. For example, increased frequency, intensity, and duration of heat waves and drought in many regions, including sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean. In semi-arid and arid climates, this can severely impact agricultural production and threaten food security. Land degradation and climate change are also major drivers of the loss of biodiversity, the very biodiversity that is vital for climate-resilient landscapes. Nature-based solutions are key to addressing the food, climate, and biodiversity crisis, building resilience, and it is absolutely crucial that we get them right. And by right, I mean inclusive and equitable design with high environmental integrity, synergies for people and planet, and avoiding perverse incentives that may create benefits in one area but inflict harm in others. In particular, there is a real risk that rising demand for land to offset greenhouse gas emissions by countries or companies in the global north increases pressure on land and other scarce resources and ultimately contributes to conflict. Nature-based solutions are not automatically win-win situations. We've already seen that very well-intended measures can carry the risk of producing negative side effects. Our joint event series here focuses on the essence of a just transformation of land use that secures people's livelihoods, provides nutritious food, mitigates climate change, and protects biodiversity. We propose the right to food as the common lens for looking at the land, climate, and food processes. As the vast majority of countries has ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that establishes the rights to food, we find it useful to think of the right to food as a safeguard and reference point for natural-based solutions and for interventions to create climate-resilient landscapes that work for people. I'm extremely grateful to the ARUA Centre of Excellence in Sustainable Food Systems, the Future Africa Project, and TMG Research for partnering with us and co-hosting this event series. Together, we will explore this globally relevant discussion through an African-European dialogue and link it to the ongoing multilateral process. We will start today by examining what defines climate resilient landscapes and how these characteristics are reflected in the discussions around the upcoming UN Food Systems Summit in New York. And during the follow-up event on the 19th of October, we will discuss how those characteristics can inform the debates in the context of agriculture and nature-based solutions at UNFCCC COP26 in Glasgow. That second event will then conclude with considerations on how to best continue an African-European dialogue on just transformation towards climate-resilient landscapes. I'm very much looking forward to this inspiring and insightful debate, and now it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Barend Erasmus, the Dean of the Faculty of Natural and Agricultural Sciences at the University of Pretoria, who's joining us from his institute in South Africa. Professor Erasmus, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gerrit, for that introduction. Chairman of TMG Research, Alexander Muller, Gerrit Hansen, Program Director of Climate Change at the Robert Bosch Stiftung, Dr. Jes Weichelt, Mwangi, also from TMG, the program team that's curating the dialogues, fellow speakers, and colleagues across the globe who have joined us today. This feels a little bit like a marriage you get into, but one where you know and believe that things are going to work out even before you have signed the paperwork. This is an exciting marriage between the University of Pretoria, TMG Research, and the Robert Bosch Stiftung. I'm excited about the partnership on Africa-European dialogues. I fully support this partnership. So as I stand here, I officiate on behalf of the University of Pretoria. But when we talk about sustainable food systems, we do have the mandate to engage in East and West Africa and be the representatives. This mandate comes from the Africa Research Universities Alliance Centre of Excellence in Sustainable Food Systems. This Centre of Excellence has the mandate to harness partnerships in research and innovation to drive agricultural and food system transformation to ensure sustainable food security and nutrition in Africa. All our work on sustainable food systems is anchored Africa-wide. The University of Pretoria has been active globally in the sustainable food systems journey, and we have had the opportunity of convening a food system dialogue for African vice-chancellors. The dialogue attracted 1,170 participants from over 62 countries. I was personally one of the moderators of this meeting together with my colleague Professor Lindiwe Sabanda, and I can assure you the high-level buy-in and the thoughtful engagement that we had on the topic bodes well for real action from higher education institutions on the continent. The second reason I'm excited about this dialogue is that it is speaking to two issues that came through in the work we're doing, and that is first, building climate resilience, and secondly, the right to food. As a university, we have committed to convening every year a food systems dialogue at the University of Pretoria. And this is because I believe everyone has the right to food, and university-wide, all our faculties and centers of excellence have a lot to do with the issue of food, be it from a science perspective or from an arts perspective. At the University of Pretoria, we have 4 strategic platforms that will be undertaking transdisciplinary research on food systems. These are the Future Africa Institute, the Engineering 4.0 Development, the Jabbit Arts Centre, and Innovation Africa. Let me zero in on Future Africa. Future Africa is a space, a physical building, a campus, and a center where Africa's leading scientists and scholars from across the world and from a broad range of disciplines come together to leverage the benefits of transdisciplinary research to address the grand challenges that face Africa and the world. Future Africa provides a dynamic platform where a community of scholars and other societal role players engage in advancing excellence in scholarship, dialogue, and impact. It is therefore my hope that as we initiate this partnership with TMG Research and Robert Bosch Stiftung, we will host you at Future Africa for the dialogues, using exchange programs with your own centers, just like you do with your scholars worldwide. In addition to being a vibrant conversation space, Future Africa is also a beautiful dedicated campus set within our expansive agricultural research property. It is my belief that unless we do transdisciplinary research on societal problems, particularly in Africa and in partnership with the world, we will not address the food systems challenges and we will not realign our food systems. Africa is the last frontier when it comes to resources. Big opportunities, but also big risks. And these are risks for the world, not just for the continent. As I look at this program, I note some very exciting sessions that deal with people and the planet and human rights. As we prepare for the road to New York Food System Summits, I want to believe that we will definitely not just speak with one voice as Africa, but speak as humanity that speaks to the right to food for everyone worldwide. Let me close with an invitation to Pretoria, where we would like to host you for next year's Food System Dialogues. With those few words, I thank you.
Well, on that note, thank you, Professor, for these kind introductory words. We are very happy to accept that invitation, and COVID permitting, we are basically booking our tickets. Now, seriously, I would like to thank both of you, Gerrit and Baron, for these introductory remarks, which already aptly alluded to the issues that gave rise to this events series. And I would like to highlight two of them. The FAO has this year published its State of Food Security and Nutrition report and highlighted very clearly that the structural reasons for hunger are poverty and inequalities. And it is poverty and the prevailing inequalities that are the very same reason for people being left vulnerable to the impact of the climate crisis. That's why we took the decision to emphasize and to look for solutions to the climate crisis and to the challenges posed by hunger and food security through the lens of rights to food. And as Gerrit has mentioned, the large majority of countries on the globe has ratified the Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. Now, the purpose of this session now will be addressing rather straightforward question. And this question is, how do we achieve building climate resilient landscapes? And when we say climate resilient landscapes, we are, of course, not thinking of landscapes being void of people, but we are thinking of landscapes that are a homestead to people, where people are free from hunger, and where they can respond to the challenges posed by the climate crisis. And obviously, climate resilient landscapes are landscapes that protect the biodiversity and mitigate the impact of climate change. We are in a very fortunate position to count on very competent and excellent speakers to help us along this journey. And if I'm rightly informed, Fatima still encounters some connection issues. So I would like to introduce to you Luc Nakatia, who is the president of GPS Development. Hi, Luc. It's nice to see you on this channel. And I would like to ask you, Luc, to please be so kind and talk us through, from your perspective, what are the trends that threaten climate resilient landscapes? What are maybe those factors that lead to climate resilient landscapes? And what are those responses that you can think of that can help us building climate resilient landscapes? Luc, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very thrilled to be part of this event. And I would like to greet all the organizers as well as those who are connected from all over the world. Let me rather focus on both the problem and what could be the way forward, especially in the context of what I know best, and that is land degradation neutrality. And you know, it is the concept behind SDG target 1503. First, we know that agriculture is the major driver of the degradation of terrestrial ecosystem, from soil and forest degradation to loss of biodiversity. And we also know that agricultural expansion, for instance, accounts for up to 80% of forest loss globally. But in some countries, it is even up to 95%. In Benin, it is 98%. That's what we have found assessing, our land status from 2000 to 2010. So land degradation neutrality represents a paradigm shift in land development and management policies and practices, as well as investment. It aims at, first, avoiding degradation, and second, counterbalancing degradation by working to restore already degraded land where the potential is available, instead of further encroaching on natural ecosystem. It strategically places the mainstreaming into public policies of the following three measures. First, we must ensure that we conserve natural ecosystem. So first is conservation. Second is to sustainably manage all land under use. And in the context of planning for land degradation neutrality, even urban planners must be around the table, because they are sometimes also quite important drivers of land degradation in rural areas through unsustainable urban-rural linkages. And third, we must ensure that I have said that we, instead of looking for a natural ecosystem to use for our need for farming, we must ensure that we rather restore what is already degraded. So this starts first at national level by what we call land degradation neutrality, or LDN country profile, that helps to have a clear mapping of where the land is in good shape and where it is experiencing processes of degradation, and where we still have potential, and by who and how to restore. Why is it so key and important for Africa? Especially in sub-Saharan Africa, the maps of poverty and food insecurity in rural areas largely correlate with those of degraded land. And when you understand that, you then therefore understand why mapping those lands, avoiding to call them marginal land, but rather land that are looking forward to receiving care and investment to thrive again, then you are in good business first to change the policies that are sustaining and driving degradation, and bring around the table all stakeholders to agree on what are the forecast for restoration, what might be its outcome, what also could be the benefit, and also the trade-off, and coming up together to discuss the trade-off, to ensure that we therefore, in a very balanced manner, we tip the process from degradation to restoration. And as you know, for instance, in Africa, through the ELD, the Economic of Land Degradation Study, there have been assessment of degradation in 42 African countries in Sub-Sahara. And the findings are, of course, quite compelling, because it is the estimate in socioeconomic terms is up to 12.3% of the GDP, the combined GDP of those countries. I can tell you that in Benin, that estimate was 8% per year. And on the contrary, the cost of action amounts only 1.15% of the combined GDP of those 42 countries. Then you can see why LDN is key for Africa, and why among the 127 countries who have already joined the LDN target setting, among them are 52 African countries. So then how can we ensure that moving forward with the implementation of LDN will not infringe on human rights, especially land tenure of indigenous communities and small farmers, smallholder farmers? First, because LDN is meant to bring the paradigm shift, first, of course, by changing the policies that are rather facilitating degradation. That is at national level, but at local level now, it is about bringing all those who are stakeholders in a given landscape to come around the same table and discuss both why they are experiencing degradation and how they could tip the balance towards restoration. And in that regard, I have to say that the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration is just a blessing for those who are aiming at implementing SDG 03. First, because we know that, ensuring that we restore or avoid degradation is not something that we can do once upon a time. It's a way of living to consider. Every dollar invested in restoration creates up to $30 in economic benefit. So it is a sound investment, and we really hope that the decade will help us to move towards avoiding degradation by ensuring that we conserve what is not yet degraded and that we maintain the dynamics toward by restoring. You know that the assessment from comparing our needs in 2015 versus 2050 in new farmland, it is equivalent to the size of Brazil if we continue encroaching on natural ecosystem. That is why we just have to balance degradation by restoration. And finally, let me say that in the decade implementation, there have been 5 task forces set up to support the implementation. And I have the privilege of chairing the task force that is working on science and how we must translate science into policies. And last week in Marseille, in the context of the IUCN World Conservation, we have released a science-based rationale for implementing restoration, and I invite you to look for it. It's available on the IUCN website. Thank you.
Thank you, Luc, and really it's sort of your passion for the topic really still very much speaks to this video message. So even in this online world, it becomes clear why you have been chosen to choose that to chair this specific working group. So thank you very much for this contribution. As I know that you have to leave rather early because of scheduling conflicts, I think I would like to pick up on one of the points that you have raised, that when creating dialogue between Africa and Europe is of utmost importance, which is the question of terminology. And when you spoke about marginal lands, we really have to be careful that these are not being thought of as lands that are empty or void of people, but they are actually stewards living on the land and trying to make their living on it. On this note, again, thanks, Luc, and I hope you will have some time to stay with us for the beginning of the discussion. I now have the honor and the pleasure to introduce to you Fatima Denton, who is the Director of the United Nations University Institute for Natural Resources in Africa. Fatima, the floor is yours.
Hi, could you hear me?
Perfectly well, thank you.
And hopefully see me.
Not yet, but I'm sure this will come. Yes.
Perfect.
Right. Excellent. And apologies, I somehow don't know what happened. I was on a different platform, but in the same meeting, so I could hear you and some of the discussions that already started. Let me maybe submit two key messages, at least from where I sit. The first one is related, because I know we're talking about rights issue and we're talking about policies. But I think we now need to think about it in terms of 3 imperatives. The first one is the speed. The second one is the scale. And the third one is the management. All these 3 things are very important in Africa. And the previous speaker, I think, could not have said it better. There's so much that we need to do in terms of land, and restoration processes and policies are ongoing. However, I have an observation, and I don't mean to be controversial, but it is still a rather an observation that I have. It seems to me that we are now talking about the urgency, the necessity, the importance of building forward better. And we all have the same narrative. So that's a given. We're all talking about it. However, it seems to me that the direction of travel in terms of how we must build forward better is not necessarily defined from an African perspective. There are so many well-intentioned solutions, and this is what I meant. I don't mean it to be, critical for just the sake of being critical. But I think we need to allow spaces. We need to allow time so that people in this part of the world could also have the opportunity to really think about innovative ways of how we could build back better. It is a given also that we're not going to build back better if we do not have a good handle on our productive capacity, especially in terms of agriculture. It seems to me that the green development that we want is not a green development that we can sort of take a journey and arrive at a certain destination point if we're not looking at issues around our land management practices, if we're not looking at issues on restoration practices and how we restore land, if we're not thinking in terms of sustainable land management as well, because sustainable land management is important, but once you want to do it on a larger scale, it penalizes farmers as well, because there are upfront costs that you have to pay for, and it's very often onerous, and farmers are not able to afford that. So I would say there has to be, if we're thinking about policies and we're thinking about scale and speed, we have to start finding our center of gravity. And for me, agriculture is our center of gravity. It's a no-brainer. We're not going to be able to go far in this mitigation exercise, this fight against climate change, if we don't come back to that center of gravity, which is agriculture. But the direction of travel is somehow, to a large extent, from at least where I sit, being really focused on energy systems. And we all know the latest IPCC Land and Climate Report made very clear mention that land is under very multiple stressors, facing multiple stressors on a lot of demand. And that increased demand on land is creating a degradation that is faster than we can replenish or restore. So much of our emissions are going to come from land. And we are a continent that is growing, and we will continue to grow. We are also a continent that is rapidly urbanizing. These are things that are not going to be easy to manage if we do not have a good sense of our agricultural systems and how we manage that, but also if we do not have food security at the heart of our development agenda. So there are policies, and this is what I meant by a redirection of what is it that we want. You have the Great Green Wall, for instance, which is a very important initiative, and this initiative is looking at nature-based solutions. I heard you mention nature-based solutions, how you restore degraded landscapes and how you can transform lives by rehabilitating, wide range of degraded land. But again, an observation is that some of these initiatives are not given the push or the support that they need. So energy is important to us, and we certainly must exploit and take advantage of the energy aspect in agriculture if we want to optimize our agriculture. But I think we must also not forget that whilst we have an ambition to do mitigation, we also have an ambition to do adaptation. And we must really find the space whereby we redirect our priorities. And by that redirection of priorities, I mean we must really find what is important. And what is important, I think, is how we can avoid, the continent has an imperative to avoid emissions. Its issue is not necessarily emissions, although emissions will grow. Its issue is about how we manage what we have, and because of the fact that we're going to be the hardest hit. So we have a management problem, I'd say. not necessarily an emissions problem. I want to just say that partnership is important, and the partnership with Europe is fundamentally important. Europe and Africa are bound together by history, by geography, and trade. So it is important that this long-sought technology transfer that we've been talking about for decades, it's not happening. How do we make it happen? The finance that we would like to see invested in Africa, where African farmers can compete at an even keel with other farmers, is not happening. The subsidies that farmers in Europe enjoy, that farmers in Africa are not enjoying, is a problem. The fact that a Sahelian farmer can produce wheat and that wheat is more expensive than if he has to import the wheat. The fact that an Ethiopian farmer can can basically produce coffee, but cannot process the coffee has to be sent like that, because if you process the coffee, you're going to pay more in terms of taxes, and charges, is a problem. So how do we take advantage of this new momentum that we are talking about, the Build Back Better, the Build Forward Better? How do we do that to make sure that the relationship between these two continents that need to work together is more symmetrical, And how do we avoid some of the, misunderstanding that we're getting, especially when you talk about things like the carbon border tax adjustment mechanism? How do we use that maybe to say, okay, if there is a pool of monies that are going to be had by taxing products that are, maybe guilty of carbon leakage, how do we ensure that there is a pool of money that can come back and support some of these farmers, that it's not a levy against them, but it's a levy that could maybe help them in terms of technology transfer. So there are several things that one could talk about, but I do believe that the policies are there in Africa. You have policies initiatives like the Africa Risk Capacity, they're doing extremely well. You have the Green Recovery Plan that the AU has now put forward, which I think would have a lot of good ideas on how you scale out and how you do so with speed. But these cannot just run on thin ice. They can't make themselves work. And I think partnership now is even more important, more critical. I always say this, it's almost a ritualistic line of mine, that Africa is a continent that needs productive partnerships. If we are going to be part of this climate exercise, climate solution, we have an even bigger role. You talked about Africa being a frontier continent. It's a frontier continent because it offers the largest demonstration space to make some of these problems right, to right some of these wrongs. It has a demonstration space because we do not have the relevant infrastructure, so we can develop that. Our agriculture is underdeveloped and underperforming, so that is something else we can do. So I can see from your nods that I have to stop. But in very, very interesting debate, and I think let's keep talking about the management aspect of this. We are a continent that needs to manage this problem. We don't have that much emissions. It's 5%, it would grow, but we now have a huge management problem, and we need support. But we need support that is symmetrical. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima, really. And sort of the timing or the sequencing of the speakers couldn't be better because sort of the next speaker in line is Sebastian Les, who is the head of the division for agricultural innovation and trade at the Ministry for Development Cooperation. For those of us who have joined us later, the screen shows the hashtag that you can use to engage with us in these discussions, and you could also use the comment function that's offered next to the live stream. Fatima, I hope that you can still be with us for the discussion, because there would be several points also that I think that we would like to pick up on. But before we move to this first round of responses to the panelists, I would like to invite you, Sebastian, to please join us. A very good afternoon. And I would like to give you the floor. And I think Fatima has given you a wide menu of options to pick from when it comes about the design and rethinking of symmetrical partnerships. So Sebastian, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with everybody today. And yes, indeed, Fatima, you've given lots of very valuable points. I'm not sure that I can really respond to all of that, but I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we are hopefully going to have. Resilience is the key word for sustainable development these days. Ever more crises and conflicts that seem to threaten the world's progress towards the SDGs, COVID being the latest, but by far not the only one of them. My unit is involved very strongly in the One World No Hunger initiative, so ending hunger and SDG 2, of course, are particularly dear to our hearts here at the ministry, and there's no other human right that is violated as often as the right to food. The number of starving and malnourished people is on the rise again. The figures are being quoted very regularly. FAO estimates a 20% rise of chronically undernourished people. That's up to 811 million people worldwide due to the pandemic, but not only due to the pandemic, due to violent conflicts and many other factors. And Sub-Saharan Africa is especially affected, sharpest in Western Africa from what we gather. There's a clear gender gap in that as an additional injustice. Food insecurity is 10% higher among women compared to men. And then, of course, as regards food and nutrition security, the high cost of healthy diets coupled with persistent high levels of income inequality that also puts healthy diets out of reach for around 3 billion people. So with the loss of income and employment due to the pandemic, that number also is very likely to have increased last year and to possibly rise further. So if we're doing business as usual, then projections tell us there's going to be a significant increase in chronic undernourishment in Africa. And despite this, there also is a trend in consumption patterns that go towards high protein diets. And that again leads to more carbon intensive agriculture that will further strain the global land use systems and that will increase greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural production. So at the same time, it's very evident that the way we currently produce and consume our food is utterly unsustainable. It has severe impacts on the environment. If we look at some of the facts, agricultural expansion is responsible for about 80% of deforestation in the tropics. Our global food systems are the primary drivers of biodiversity loss. Agriculture alone being identified as a threat to 86% of species at the risk of extinction. 1/4 of the global anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. And as Fatima rightly said, we need to tackle that if we need to tackle the climate crisis. And while agriculture is a significant driver of climate change, of course, climate change itself further stresses the agri-food systems. Climate-related natural disasters are increasing at an alarming rate. That significantly impacts smallholder farmers, especially in the developing countries. And that again then rises the pressure on landscapes. Land is needed for infrastructure, for housing, for industry, and also for agriculture. And that land that is usable for agriculture is at the same time getting scarcer. So that is a really challenging situation. Still, as the special initiative One World Without Hunger, we are still deeply convinced that One World Without Hunger is possible, and that it is possible within planetary boundaries, and that it is possible to fight hunger and poverty while we're at the same time working towards saving forests, saving biodiversity, and saving the climate. But to achieve this, we must transform our agriculture and food systems. They must change. They must perform differently. They must become climate smart, they must become resilient to shocks of all kinds, and they must become sustainable. Sustainable ecologically, sustainable socially, sustainable economically, all three of that at the same time. We stand for a holistic approach that is multi-sectoral, in which food security, rural development, and agriculture itself complement each other and interact systemically, because we believe that the rural population in the developing world needs prospects for their future, with an income, with employment opportunities in rural areas, with decent living conditions in rural areas. And that entails all sorts of things. That entails rural governance that is participatory, that entails legally secured access to land, that entails economic development in rural areas, that entails conservation, rehabilitation of natural resources in compliance, for example, with agroecological principles, as well as contributions to climate protection, resilience. All that is key and is a key as a starting point for our measures. Now, the degradation of ecosystems is both a cause and an effect of poverty and food insecurity. And landscapes need to provide incomes and livelihoods for people in rural regions. The way in which resources are used has an impact on biodiversity and on the global climate, among other things. So landscapes therefore provide opportunities for slowing the process of climate change. But a comprehensive and integrated approach needs to be the foundation for sustainable management of landscapes that really enable those compromises between those various interests that are going on. What are the key factors to make landscapes resilient for food and nutrition security, for sustainable livelihoods, and for climate change adaptation and mitigation at the same time? We think that the different stakeholders within that landscape need to balance their different needs and interests regarding the use of their landscape and negotiate the kind of use of their landscape. We believe that since different sectors are relevant within landscape, sectoral policies must be coordinated in a coherent way. There must be policy coherence. We think that secure access to land and water and equal use rights of natural resources are essential if you want to preserve the livelihoods of the people living within that landscape. And we believe that landscape approaches need to contribute to ecosystem-friendly, climate-resilient, low-emission, sustainable, that is, production systems, besides focusing on the economic benefit for the local population. So the landscape approach contributes to achieving all sorts of international all sorts of international approaches, and I think that context is quite important because that builds in the sort of multilateral international sphere into this approach. There is the IG biodiversity targets, there's the Paris Agreement, of course, there's the New York Declaration on Forests, there is the Bonn Challenge, there is the current UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. All sorts of things are there that we need to can build into. How is the ministry that I'm working for responding to these trends? Because that's really a very large field that I'm describing there. I'd like to give the example of this special initiative, One World, No Hunger, and our beliefs that I mentioned are enshrined into that. We believe that there needs to be a systemic approach. I've said that before, a systemic approach that connects rural development, agriculture itself, food security, agro-food systems. We believe in networks. We need networks that don't only go on between country governments, that include research, agricultural research, applied science, businesses and the economy, civil society, farmers organizations. An interesting case, they're usually small businesses themselves, but they're also part of the civil society. We think it needs to include small and medium enterprises. We believe in an innovation-driven approach. We think that innovation needs to be at the center of all that. Resource-friendly, sustainable agricultural practices can be driven through innovation. And we believe that we need to build this into a multilateral framework. We have, from the beginning of the initiative, tried to build it into the G7 and G20 frameworks. If you think of the German G7 presidency in 2015, where we launched the Elmau goal of saving 500 million people from hunger and malnutrition, the G20 initiative that we launched in 2017 on youth employment in rural areas. Germany has the G7 presidency again next year, so we're hoping to build on that and use that multilateral context as well. I need to mention the UN Food System Summit just very briefly before I close. That is going on right now. We believe here at the Ministry that we need bold actions to transform our food systems for improved economic, environmental, social and nutrition outcomes. And we need that kind of multi-sectoral partnerships that are going on. We need to create platforms where stakeholders come together, develop their goals, bring forward their action. We need to talk about the governance of the food system and the agro-food system, worldwide, regional, national. I think there's a lot of potential in driving that forward, and we hope that the UN Food System Summit will live up to that potential. I leave it at that, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian, for really taking us as a tour de force, really through both the impressive investment portfolio by the ministry, as well as already building the bridge to the UN Food System Summit. I have negotiated with Wangu that I can have a quick round between the panelists. So Fatima, if I may ask you to please switch on your camera again, because I would have a question to the two of you. Thank you. And I think the question that intrigued me is the question, I think you labeled those points, Fatima, speed, scale, and management. And I would like to sort of relate this to the points that Sebastian has made, that in fact we might not have all the same interest in one particular landscape. And if we move very quickly towards scale, how do we make sure that the interests of those who might already find it difficult to articulate their voices are sort of duly considered in this process? And I think I would like to invite you, Fatima, first to respond to this, and then Sebastian, I would like to give you the word.
Thank you very much. Well, I think it's already been said quite a bit that at the heart of this conversation in terms of scale and in terms of, addressing some of the known climate problems, equity is at the heart of it. So the equity issue, I think we need to intentionally bring it back in, because I think we talk about it, but it's not sufficiently strong and it's not sufficiently intentional. One example is in our debate, our conversation about building forward better, there is not enough funding or financing that is going into how we might build forward better, and this is irrespective of the sectors that we're looking at. Yet we know that when the crisis happened and we're still going through it, the coronavirus, most African farmers were hugely tested, especially in terms of their resilience, because the buffer systems that they would need to rely on and lean on were not available. It derailed completely, our supply systems. So I think in as much as we're planning a recovery process, we need to plan a recovery process with people in mind. And this would also mean that we should also be talking to not just our farmers, but the informal sector. The informal sector is one of the largest purveyors of jobs in Africa, and they're very often left on the sidelines. So I think the way to do it is think about, all the traditional things we've done in the past, from agronomic practices, conservation practices, water management practices. A lot of the things that Sebastian was talking about are all relevant. But I think we need to do it with a people focus, and we need to be very intentional about how we do this.
Fatima, and I think you've already built the bridge to the second group of people. I think Nomonde will be happily picking up on the points that you've just made. Sebastian, you mentioned the key word governance in relation to the Food System Summit, but also in relation to landscapes and balancing the various interests. May I ask you to expand on how you would really see sort of this driving forward through the One World, No Hunger initiative?
Well, there are different interests, obviously, by different stakeholders. But I think there should be one interest where you can sort of gain common ground, and that would be sustainability. All stakeholders, I would assume, ultimately have an interest in sustainability with all the dimensions that sustainability has. Bringing that into balance is a difficult task, but you need to really go through that on all the levels. And there's, I think, no bypassing that. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. There's no bypassing a process where you balance those different interests. And that's called politics, right? You start that on the level of the landscape itself, where you need to have the right governance of those people who have an interest in being in that landscape, in using that landscape. You need to go to the national level, and you need to go to the international level. On the international level, that is about trade, and some of those facts around that have been mentioned by Fatima. On the national levels, it's about, for example, subsidies. I'll mention the European market on that as an example, and some people will not like me doing that, but there is a huge subsidy system available on the European market. We have to talk about the incentives, for example, that would give. We have to talk about trade systems, and not so much the things that we focus on in Germany a lot, of trade between Africa and the EU. But trade within the regions, within Africa. There's a lot going on in that discussion right now that we can link in, that we can support, that we can share experience on. So that opens up a whole array of things. And I think really, yes, it is complex, and there's no bypassing that complexity. There's no one solution to that. But I think if we heartily dive into that and start tackling that, then we're going to make progress. And if the Food System Summit can do one thing, it can wake up people to dive into that. That would be my sort of minimum hope into the process.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing your sort of your minimum requirement for the Food System Summit with us. That's definitely something we will consider in the later part of the discussions. And I think you have raised one point, Sebastian, that I would like to pick up and hand over to my co-moderator. In the end, you said, in the end, it's about politics of negotiating these different interests. And I think the question of who gets to be heard in these processes is at the heart of achieving equity that Fatima has mentioned. And with this, Wangu, it's over to you. Thank you very much, both Fatima and Sebastian, for taking the time. I hope you can stay on. We will invite another round of comments afterward. We've reheard the other responses. But thank you very much so far. Wangu, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I'm not going to say anything more than just throw it straight down to Nomonde, who's joining us from South Africa. I think one of the interesting things that was mentioned was that, you know, the face of the African farmer is often rural, but actually urbanization is growing in Africa. So what does this mean for urban-based farmers? And Nomonde is one of those urban-based farmers. So let's get real here and let's hear from her. Welcome, Nomonde.
Thank you, Wangu, and thank you everyone present. I'm Nomonde Utelezi. As Wangu had said, I am joining you from the Heinrich Bol Foundation in Cape Town. I am from an organization called Food Agency Cape Town. I'm a co-founder and I'm also a food activist and also a community research. So just to give a little bit of background on our organization, we conducted research with the help of the Center for Rural Development, their academics, and also our local academics, where we took a deep dive and we look at the food insecurity into our households in South Africa and in our immediate neighborhood. So once the study was done and we were sharing back the facts, we were sharing back the findings, it was with those shareback sessions that we actually realized how severe and dire our situation really was. It was with those shareback sessions that we realized that there's so much stigma and there's so much shame attached or associated with poverty. Meanwhile, we all go through it, but we don't feel comfortable talking about it. You don't want to know that your next door neighbor, you don't want them to know that you don't have any food. So through the recommendations after those shareback sessions, we then realized we visioned on how we can actually address this situation, because it's not just poverty, it's not just hunger, but there are other social issues that we as communities also go through, which contribute to the current situation. I mean, I'm talking about the gender-based violence, and if you look at the statistics of the high unemployment rate in South Africa, you will realize, and unfortunately we actually do not have any control over that. So it was with that time that people said, you know what, poverty is not anything new in Africa. Poverty was there even before COVID, but what COVID did was to actually just highlight and to actually expose the severity of it. So where we are at the moment as FACT or Food Agency Cape Town, the recommendations was that we work through our kitchens in addressing our current situations in our communities. How do we do that through our kitchens? With the rise of COVID, there were a lot of community kitchens that popped up that were serving food to people, but they were just that, you know, they were kitchens, they were popularly known as soup kitchens. People would queue for hours and get dished food and then go home. But then it's not really, it wasn't really, how can I put it? It wasn't really addressing, because what we wanted was how do we look at those kitchens? How do we come together as communities and work around those kitchens and make those kitchens a focus and a central point to actually combat the food insecurities that we were currently facing? I mean, people had already given up on our government. So with self-organizing, with the community action networks, people then started to take the power, and then we started to also realize our agency. And therefore, with the recommendations, with those kitchens or through those kitchens, what we are looking at in the future is to take back our dignity, is to give back our communities the voice that we don't have. There was a lot of conversations that were happening about us, but not with us. People seem to have to be able to sit and decide what we need and then try to implement, but that has really never worked. So, and then we are also forwarding our communities the right to healthy and nutritious food. We ensure that the work, we work against the unjust system that created the poverty to begin with. So through restoring dignity. With our work, we are also raising awareness and looking at poverty as a disease. And therefore, we address the poverty, we address the root cause, and how we do that is through holding dialogues, through podcasts. We actually have one that was released not so long ago, and other community activities. So we are thinking about food as a right, and the fact is food should be free. So we ensure that through our community kitchens, that they are more than just places, like I said, that serve food, but rather they become hubs where we as communities take back our dignity, where we identify challenges, and together as communities actually come up with solutions together and address also these other social issues like I've mentioned, such as the gender-based violence, and also to actually talk openly.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up. Thanks.
Yes, yes. So to also so to come up with solutions and address these gender-based violence. So just in closing, with the kitchens, we are happy. We have formed partnerships, we have formed collaborations, and like I said, we use the kitchens as a center point. So this is actually our call to say, look, come down to the people through community research, find out what really our needs are, ask us what is it that we want, and then as together we can implement and address the issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nomonde. No, that's fantastic. And thank you for really highlighting, what the situation is like, because sometimes we get caught up in the policy dialogue and the buzzwords, and sometimes we just forget what this means. And when you mention something like dignity and shame, and these are just the everyday realities that people go through, and it's really nice that you remind us of that. And I think then our next speaker really picks up on this and really addresses these issues of fairness and justice and equity, and that's Muthoni Wanyeki, who is the Regional Director for Africa for the Open Society Foundation. Welcome, Muthoni. We'd love to hear from you and your take on how we build on these issues to really address rights at a global level. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to be with you today. I do feel a bit like an imposter. I'm not a climate or food expert, but I do come from the human rights movement and can speak a little bit to that, especially on issues of land, women's land rights, and so on. I was asked to speak to how external support can sort of focus better on supporting community initiatives like our colleague from South Africa just talked about on the right to food and other human rights. And when I was thinking about how to answer that, I thought it would be good to sort of reference the African Green Revolution Forum. As you all know, it was held in Nairobi earlier this month, and it articulated 5 key aims of the African Common Position for the summit. Upping agricultural and food production, especially for smallholders and women, upping investment finance around issues of food and the whole sort of food chain, ensuring safe and nutritious food is available through local and regional food markets, and building resilience, early warning and social protection, all of which colleagues on this panel have already spoken about. These points of the African Common Position, of course, resonate with the 5 action tracks of the summit process: ensuring the availability of safe and nutritious food, sustainable consumption, nature-positive production, sustainable livelihoods for women, smallholders, and pastoralists, as well as other quote-unquote indigenous communities, and again, questions of resilience. So the issues are known, and I guess the question really is how, if external support is looking for bottom-up approaches, do we all move towards these aims? And I think one answer lies in what Fatima just spoke about, the equality issue that was also really interestingly highlighted by the chairs and vice chairs of the scientific group for the summit. And they really pushed the issue of focusing on equality and rights as concerns labor, land, and credit for women, smallholders, and pastoralists, as well as other indigenous communities. And just drawing from that, we need to sort of remind ourselves of stuff that we know. It's been on the table for 20, 30 years already. We know that women tend to disproportionately bear the burden of reproductive and community labor while being unequally compensated for productive labor, including in agriculture. Women still tend to have only access to, that is, user rights over land, and not control ownership rights over land. And we still tend to also not control benefits derived from land, so control over household incomes. Women still tend to be responsible primarily for subsistence agriculture. That's the food that we're talking about today, and far less so for cash crops. Moving to a sort of other domain of work, away from the sort of women's equality domain, coming to the sort of social protection domain, which has come up several times in different ways, but a bit fuzzily around issues of resilience. We know when we think of social protection as including not just social insurance and social assistance, but also, again, equality and the informal and traditional ways by which women mitigate risk and external shocks, then it's very clear, or it should be clear, that women in the informal sector, including those in smallholder production, are still very largely outside what social insurance exists, which is, of course, in our context geared towards the very small minority of us in formal employment, and depending on distribution mechanisms and for social assistance, which tends to be to heads of household, i.e. men, women can be locked out there too. All of these problems, which we've known about for a long time, point to really clear areas of potential intervention and support for externals to link to on the land, climate, and food imperatives of the summit. That is, it should be easy for us to see as externals that we can support from a new lens at work on ending discrimination and advancing legal equality, as well as equality in relevant sectors, such as securing women's land rights, but also securing women's rights to the full range of social protection, social insurance, social assistance, and building on, investing in, taking seriously women's informal and traditional mechanisms of social protection, the chamas, the merry-go-rounds, the tontins, the models for zakat, all of which are not just savings and investment mechanisms into what women's livelihoods, but also in times of risk and external shocks, mechanisms of risk mitigation and shock management. That's on the women's rights side of things. I would say similar things about the land rights of pastoralists and other indigenous communities. We should know, relatively speaking, even though it seems counterintuitive, that the productivity and returns from pastoralism are actually higher than those of smallholders within Africa. And there are many, many reasons for that. All of which you would think would necessitate a more facilitative approach to pastoralism and really investing in pastoralist livelihoods, rather than the attempts we continue to see across the continent, from the Horn to the Sahel, about making pastoralists sedentary. We should see, too, that investing in communal land rights and facilitation as other potential areas of intervention and support by externals. Which moves me to sort of lessons. I was asked to speak to lessons or sort of good practices in strengthening civic movements that could apply to smallholder farmers and pastoralists. I, of course, believe the organization I work for believes very strongly in the question of African voice and agency, again, which my colleague from South Africa just sort of highlighted, the need for African voice and agency. But of course, here it's important to acknowledge, as she said, that there's no single African voice and thus no single form of agency. What's often heard in these debates is the voice of agribusiness and conservation, and it's those two groups that have the wherewithal to truly exercise agency. So investing in the self-representation and self-organization of smallholders and pastoralists is critical, which the colleague from GIZ also pointed out. And I think here what we need to do is go back to forms of self-representation and self-organization that are either invisible, like the informal and traditional mechanisms women use for social protection, or those that have been considerably weakened over time for a long variety of reasons, like smallholder cooperatives. Peer exchanges within countries across the continent allow for comparative learning, build a base for ongoing solidarity and much more collective, stronger self-organization and representation with influence, actual influence. And linkages of those groups with other civic actors and social impact investors coming at the same problems in different ways is also important. That's the more strictly legal actors, the research and policy actors, and so on. It's clear that the crisis is multifaceted. It requires cross-sectoral and interdisciplinary approaches. External actors, and even though I'm African, I do work for an external actor, we're often in the highly privileged position of being able to hold the bird's eye view, and we should be able to put that privilege to work in making these connections that need to be made. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Muthoni. Really, thank you, because you've really picked up so well from where Nomonde left off to really show that this is a struggle also, just like broader, human rights and women's rights struggles are, and the struggles of pastoralists. So thank you very much for making those connections and showing us that we are really in a bigger battle together. And so I'm sorry to make it look like I then put this back to the European to answer, but Mark Knowlting, who is working with GIZ and heads their program on Global Agenda for Food and Nutrition, I'm going to have to ask you to then pick up on this, and you don't have to feel that you have to answer all the questions, but please let us know how can we really track that we're making progress on some of these issues that have been highlighted. Thank you. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for inviting me this afternoon. Well, having listened to the good examples of efforts for bilateral, regional, or global projects or initiatives that contribute to the resilient landscapes for people and planet, I think we can conclude that there are already very, very good examples that have actually the potential to be scaled up, ideally in a joint fashion and effort and with pooled resources. And I could add other projects, examples that fall within my unit or portfolio I'm managing, but I better save those for the discussion. However, looking at the whole discussion, and particularly at the land-food-climate nexus from a more systemic perspective and in a more systemic way, I think that the current situation can be best described with two words: system failure. So those two words, system failure, we all know they usually appear as an error message on our screen or electronic device once a program or software has crashed, and which usually causes the system to stop functioning altogether. Now, usually we are then left with no other choice than rebooting the system. And usually what happens then is that the hardware is still okay, well, at least in most cases, and we get the opportunity for a fresh start. And I think this is exactly the point, the tipping point where we are currently with food systems globally, but more specifically also with the land-food-climate nexus. The hardware might be still okay, but the software is obviously not. Whether you look at the land climate food nexus or the whole food systems, it is obvious that the current system is in disorder. And this is not just recently. This has been a very slow development over the recent decades, which has been, of course, as we all know, amplified drastically by climate change. Now, let me try to underpin this hypothesis or argument with a few points related to agriculture production or agriculture in general, which Fatima Denton in her speech has called the center of gravity. And those points, by the way, have also been elaborated by the OECD in its recent report, Making Better Policies for Food Systems. So I think what we can observe is that historically, greater food production meant greater land use. And Luc has in his speech highlighted the issue of degraded land resources. However, there has been a decoupling of greater food production and greater land use since about the 1960s. And this decoupling was initially driven by greater use of inputs. But in recent decades, production growth increasingly comes from efficiency gains. And at the same time, what we observe is that these efficiency gains have also led to lower food prices, which is, of course, good news for the consumers, but challenging in most cases for farmers. And nowadays, our food systems exert important pressures on the environment. Much of the damage occurs still at the agriculture production stage. And ironically, agriculture production is increasingly influenced negatively by climate change. Well, and we all know what the results today are, and it has been highlighted by the previous speakers, by Sebastian Les, that the food sector emits about 30% of the world's greenhouse gases, and that expansion of cropland, tree plantations, mostly in the tropics, is still contributing drastically to the loss in forests. So in essence, I think the whole global food system is deteriorated, characterized by a high level of disruptive factors, and at the same time, agricultural policies or policies in general, which have been mentioned also by the previous speakers, are not addressing these challenges and are very often even counterproductive. Now, looking at development cooperation and development aid, what we observe in this context is that most of the funding still goes to agriculture or rural development and food aid, but in rather siloed ways. And this, I think, needs to change. This definitely needs to change. There must be a more holistic approach. And I think the special initiative One World No Hunger mentioned by Sebastian Les is a very good example how to address an issue in a more systemic way. So we know we need to have this comprehensive and more systemic approach to tackle this issue, but this does not mean that all projects or all donors or development agencies should tackle all the issues at the same time. So what we need is we need to have a current approach through different projects, programs, initiatives, but most importantly, also better coordination of different efforts and different initiatives. So therefore, a few recommendations from my side, and the first one goes towards science. A group of leading scientists, you know them all, the UNFSS scientific group, has recently, in fact, a couple of days ago, published its Nature paper, Food Systems, 7 Priorities to End Hunger and to Protect the Planet. So you may agree or disagree with what is mentioned there at 7 priorities, and I don't want to go into the details of those 7 priorities, but what counts is that the science has developed science or has articulated science-driven advances, priorities, and those have been identified. And therefore, I think that science is one lens, or is going to be one important lens for making sure that challenges are integrated and collectively deliver better outcomes. Therefore, involving scientific institutions, including the international ones, the CG system, is, from my perspective, crucial for a, let's call it a policy science interface, but also for modeling of scalable solutions and for harmonizing the different initiatives. Sebastian Les has already summarized important key factors that make landscapes resilient for food security, that provide sustainable
I'm not sure whether I do get through to you, but I would ask you to maybe sort of address the other recommendation that we have in a little bit more concise way, so that we can then jointly move towards the discussion.
Okay, great. So let me probably just re-emphasize three. So multi-stakeholder processes for the management of interdependent objectives. This has been mentioned. I think it's extremely important to facilitate those multi-stakeholder processes, because policy and administrative measures and guidelines that focus exclusively on one issue are counterproductive. The second one is legal certainty of tenure and equal use of rights of natural resources, which has already been addressed. So successful joint use of natural resources that requires transparent rules and effective governance structures at local levels. This is the second, I think, very important aspect. And the third one is to promote public and private investment in landscapes, because national governments, that's at least our experience, can support, of course, the mobilization of private sector investments by, for example, initiating joint investment plans. So I'd better stop here for the second.
Sorry, Mark, for being pushy here, but there's we really would want to move into a joint discussion on these topics. And if I may ask our directors to please be so kind and put the all panelists, and thank you. Oh, and Luc, you're also back. That's nice. Thank you. I have the honor to now come up with 2 or 3 questions that I will share with you. And in fact, I would like to offer the floor to Nomonde and to address the, if I paraphrased Fatima correctly, the safe space for the discussion, so that solutions can be found in a democratic way, in a way that actually speaks to the necessities and the speed of the communities. If you feel like responding to this point, Nomonde, I think this would be very interesting. My second question would go to Sebastian, and whether you feel like giving one example where you, from the experience of the Special Initiative One World No Hunger, could give an example of where partnership has really truly, let's say, evolved in the way that we have discussed here. And my third question, then I stop and leave to go before I move to the second round of questions, the governance question. And Luc, there, I would be really interested from your point of view. The Food System Summit is moving towards national action plans. There have been national land degradation neutrality plans. And I would ask you from your point of view to really say, what are the do's and don'ts in designing these national level processes? But first, Nomonde, if you feel like it, I would first like to give you the floor, and then Sebastian and Luc.
Thank you. I hope I'm able to respond to your question. There was a lot of conversations, there was a lot of dialogues that were actually happening about us, but they were happening without us. So with COVID, with anyone being at home, I would have the privilege to actually log on, because it was conversation about food insecurity, it was about urban farming. So as a farmer myself, but I would feel completely out of place. So that was where the frustration came. First, it would be the language. It wouldn't allow me. It was a jargon that wouldn't be used. And I was thinking, if this conversation is about me as a poor person, and yet I'm unable to interact, I'm unable to voice, I'm unable to say exactly what I'm saying and what I want to say, I'm intimidated by first the panel that is there, I do not feel that I fit in, then how is this helping me? So it was then that we said, look, let us have these conversations in our own spaces. Let us bring people together and let them feel free and comfortable to actually speak in the way that they want. So we use the kitchens as a center point for that. We use the kitchens as a hub. With this technology and advancement and everything happening, we still have people in our communities that are unable to access the internet for information. With the schools now with COVID, there are online registrations. So an elderly person who needs to register their grandchild at a school via the internet is unable to do that. But in the kitchen, if there's a space that actually provides that access to any other person who doesn't have it. So in the kitchen, if you are able to come and sit down and be served food with dignity, and that you don't feel like you just go there and beg for food. So we organize ourselves, we create linkages, we link local activators, we link everyone is a consumer, but not everyone is a farmer. So in our communities, we have a lot of urban farmers. I am one of them. I grow food organically, but in my community, the food that I grow is not really consumed. The marketing companies come, they take my produce, it is boxed, it is sold to the elite. So how do I ensure that the food that is healthy that I'm growing is consumed in my own community? Why not do that through the kitchens? You know, why not provide our own people the healthy food that we are growing? I mean, it's growing. I'm growing it right there on my backyard. So we link early childhood centers. We link the youth. We link just everyone. We bring the community together. We say, here's a platform. Here's the situation. Let us identify what the challenge is. Let us come together with a solution. Let us address it. So we document everything. We're trying to keep our economy in our communities. We're trying to keep our data. We own the data. We are tired of researchers just coming and doing a research. We are just tired of being statistics, and we don't even hear back of the findings or what had happened. Sometimes you're not even credited in whatever research that was done on you. You just hear from someone that I saw a picture of you, or I saw a clip of you, and I mean, no one comes, they don't even, I mean, just to mention your name, that the source is Nomonde Buteles. So we were just tired, you know, we want to take back our spaces.
This is exactly why I'd asked you the question. Thank you very much for this very honest answer. And Sebastian, I'm afraid I'm putting you on the hot seat again. But my question to partnerships, really, as the government is so strongly working on designing inclusive value chains, sort of, I think what Nomanda has just said on creating value in the community and having the community in the driving seat. Could you give from your experience from your work one example where you'd say, listen, this is where I really had seen a partnership approach working?
Yes, absolutely. I'd actually like to give you two examples, two very different examples, and I promise to be brief. One links exactly, I think, into what Nomonde has been saying. As we've tried to be innovative with the instruments that we're using within our special initiative, and as we were able to gather additional funding, what we set up was a sort of twinning program between German and European farmers organizations and African farmers organizations, both on the African continental level as well as on the regional and national levels. And we were actually linking up farmers to farmers. No political influence from either a government. This was about empowerment of the farmer's voice in the process. Opening the space to farmers to actually participate in that discussion about their livelihoods, their landscapes that is going on, and empowering them to take part in that. Now, I may or may not always like what the German Farmers Association says or does in terms of sustainability policy on the European market, but I think it's hugely important to enable that talk farmer to farmer. And that is something that we've been doing, and that is, as far as I gather from the feedback from all sides, is running very successfully and is really empowering people to raise their voice and speak in the process. And I think that is a necessity for progress. And I'm very much with Nomonde there. The second example I want to give you is more on the European level, because I think we should also take that responsibility in. We've been working European-wide on European legislation against deforestation, and try to use mechanisms from trade and from market access to make progress on that particular sustainability issue. We are trying to introduce on the European level a due diligence legislation in terms of deforestation. It's a huge effort because we need to bring all the member states with their particular interests on the table. We need to bring all the branches of policy on the table, the agriculture people, the environment people, the trade people, the development people, but we're making progress on that. That is another level that we're trying to push that we hope has an impact in terms of sustainability. So those two examples maybe. There are more, but that's maybe two very different pictures.
Thank you, and thank you really for responding truly to this very difficult matter. Luc, sort of under your leadership of UNCCD, the idea was born to have national level processes to arrive at land degradation neutrality. When you listen to these considerations on partnerships, and what would be your message then for the UN decade on ecosystem restoration if you consider both the partnerships as well as your earlier experience on land degradation neutrality plans at the national level? And Luc, I'm afraid you're muted.
No? You do? Do you hear me?
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Thank you. I think all partners need to agree that our food systems, from production to transformation and consumption, are built on and addicted to ecosystem degradation. Agreeing on that will help to move towards, first, a policy change that is needed to phase out policies and subsidies that are actually enhancing ecosystem degradation, and replace them with incentives that will work for people at grassroots level, at landscape level, to move them to consider how to invest into conservation and restoration. This is huge. Assessments are quite high that we have in the range of $500 billion globally being used, and that are not working for sustainable landscape management. As a matter of fact, when you take the 700 billion used annually globally that are for subsidies on agriculture, only 3% work for conservation. So there's a huge work to do in assessing policies and transform them towards conservation and restoration. The second thing that is key at grassroots level is at local level, local governance level, bringing all stakeholders, public, private, civil society around the table in mapping the land status and agreeing on where degradation are ongoing, and bring land users, all of them, to agree on how to tip the balance towards restoration. There might be more to do, but at least those two things, one at the national level, the second at the local level, are key and essential.
My second round of questions goes to Fatima, Muthoni, and Mark. And I would like to start with you, Fatima, because I was really intrigued by how you, if I have understood you correctly, how you portrayed the possible friction between the need for speed and scale, and at the same time leaving the space, the democratic space, for finding adapted solutions. And I think if you could address how, from your point of view, this friction could be solved, and maybe there's one question by one of our viewers, and the viewer asks, to what extent can we ensure that, sort of, while even at the national level there might be policies working towards the direction, that they truly consider that municipal policies might be running in a totally counter direction. So working across these levels is one of the points that our viewers seem to be particularly interesting. So the overarching umbrella, how to address this possible friction between speed and leaving space for discussion, and how to organize this in this challenging, possibly decentralized governance sphere. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think the first thing to do is to own up, or at least recognize that there are multiple transitions that are happening, and transitions are happening at different scales. So we can't be in all these transitions, because the transitions are to some extent contingent on our capacity, our ability, our knowledge, and even the infrastructures and the tools that we have to be part of the transition. But what I think we can do in terms of the creative space, and I liked a lot of what Numonde mentioned, and also our colleague from GIZ, is there is an overwhelming sense, and I say it with a sense of frustration, there's an overwhelming sense that the parameters are already set. So we have to widen the space to enable these different voices that Mutoni was talking about to emerge. Because there's not a single voice, there are different voices. But the redirection of that space is very important, because if we do not redirect the space to where we have priorities, we are a land-based economy. Our systems are very much dominant on land and agriculture. It's our oxygen. But if we sort of tangentially focus heavily on where the world's emission is coming from, which is energy, which happens to be another big problem of ours, but if we focus exclusively on that, then we would be slightly off tangent, and we need to find our constitutional space, if I can put it that way. The space is in recognizing that our innovation is very often killed, because when you tax farmers and you don't allow them to be able to produce in a manner that would really enable them to be competitive, you kill their innovation as well. So we have to find a way whereby we can think about all these equity, social equity related issues, as well as the technological implications. Our farmers cannot compete right now because the space for competition is taken away from them. And that has to do with not just our trading systems, how we trade with other partners, but it also has to do with our own agricultural systems and our own agricultural policies. So COVID is not something we would wish on ourselves, because it has caused a lot of devastation. But it is a crash course on how we can build a better business model. The current business model, and going back to the gentleman from BMZ said, the current business model is analogous to a system failure. It's not all bad, because we cannot just sort of lament about everything. There are good things that are happening. But we really need to set the dials again. We need to find those dials. And we need to go back to base in terms of what works for the continent. And adaptation at the moment, I have a sense, is being somewhat delegitimized. Whilst we want to do agriculture-related mitigation, because that is important for our land systems, I think we also have to give some space to the importance and, the essence of good adaptation practices.
Thank you, Fatima. And sort of as you mentioned, Mark, I would take you next. And I think that's a point that we keep discussing a lot at TMG when we speak about the Food System Summit. Is it truly a system failure, or is the system not sort of exactly performing the way we want it to do, and in this regard, even performing particularly well, producing these externalities and the damage that are done? So is sort of building on what Fatima has said, is your analogy of the system failure that we are observing, if I look at the sort of the system itself and not the outcome, is it a real system failure, or is the system outperforming itself?
Well, don't get me wrong, I was not saying that the Food System Summit or the whole process towards the summit with all its preparation and efforts is a system failure. But the fact that we have this food summit forthcoming, I think is already explaining or justifying, that let's call it the global community really has realized that the system as it currently works, or it has been working or performing over the past years, is no longer functioning. So I think good news is that the community globally now comes together to discuss this towards more joint efforts, with all the different coalitions and action tracks that are currently being discussed. I think this is the right move. We don't know what will be really the outcome of the summit, but I would expect more a common sense agreement of what really needs to be done, where priorities have to be set. And this is what I called in my speech a kind of reboot, I think, which is necessary and which will certainly happening, and which will, and this is what I expect also, will have an impact on also the way we do development cooperation. So ideally, we will take into account the findings, the recommendations, and even new initiatives that might come out of the summit into account for the design, implementation of our ongoing, but most importantly, for our new projects or programs. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you, Mark. And last but not least, Muthoni, my assumption would be that a lot of what has been said in terms of redesigning governance processes for equity, giving voice, very much resonates with you arguing from a human rights perspective. And at the same time, I would like to contrast this that there is what is being labeled a shrinking democratic space. So, and again, I'm asking regarding the national level processes that are about to be set in place after the Food System Summit. From your point of view, if the national plans are to be developed in an inclusive way in view of shrinking democratic space, what would be your recommendations, your key considerations that you would like to pass on to say these are the key characteristics or the design features that these national processes need to live up to?
Thanks. I mean, obviously, I would agree with the general assessment that civic and political space is diminishing. But that's not true in all sectors, and it's certainly not true in sectors that states consider obviously completely important to their economies, like agriculture. So I do think that problem of will people be closed out just because of the overall situation? No. But I think the question from the audience is more the interesting one, the tension between the municipal/local government and national governments. And of course, it's at the municipal and local level where things are really at the coalface, where governments, local level governments, are really trying to deliver or seeing or having to deal with deficits around food, real effects of climate change on their constituencies, and so on and so forth. So, but the problem is, as we all know, that generally multilateral processes include national levels of government and not so much municipal or local levels of government. So that's one level of exclusion. And our governments in general are not so good at managing public participation or multi-stakeholder approaches beyond the private sector, beyond ones that they can clearly see here's added value. So the kinds of groups that I and my colleague from South Africa were speaking about, not so much in the picture. And even when they do bring them in to consultations of this nature, there's a real problem of power around how people can negotiate and balance out real competing interests, because this isn't a case of good or bad. It's a question of real policy dilemmas in some instances, if you're thinking about, I don't know, energy or water. So I think those are all processes of governance that we all have to get collectively better at. And then the last deficit is this ability then to aggregate up from what is coming from the local municipal level of government, what's coming from genuinely multi-stakeholder processes, and how do we reflect that in our national position so that the national action plans don't seem as a diffusion of what's decided at the multilateral level down, but actually the multilateral level is built from what nations themselves have decided these are our collective priorities.
Thank you, Muthoni, for taking on that point. I'm afraid I won't do justice to the richness of your contributions so far, as we have run significantly over time. I would like to thank you very much for your contributions. I will we're back with a wrap-up at the beginning of the next segment. I would like to thank you very much for taking the time, for sharing your thoughts and your expertise. We will start again at 15:50, so 10 minutes from now. This is CET. I was told I should express myself in UTC, but I'm afraid UTC is beyond my cognitive capacities. So I would say wherever you are, it's CET, so 10 minutes to 4 CET in 10 minutes time. Thank you very much, and thank you very much really for taking the time. You have been marvelous. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi there, welcome back after a very intriguing and fascinating first segment. Welcome back to the second part of this event. You see, we got standing up to sort of take some energy from the first session into the second segment and through the afternoon. We had closed the last segment on basically discussing the right to food from the perspective of the right to participation, how we actually are able to, or who is able to influence and to take part in these national level processes. And I think this was a perfect segue into the second segment, where we now want to bring these very rich and arguably broader discussions that we had in the first segment and relate them to the discussion to the Food System Summit more explicitly. And I think from now, it's fair to say that a good part of the emphasis in the follow-up to the summit will be lying on the national level processes. And so everything that we discussed just now on the design of the process, what Nomonde has said is who is heard, who's not being heard, Muthoni's contribution, the question that Mark has raised, to what extent can we actually translate the discussions at the Food System Summit into different policies and programs. Fatima's concern on the safe space for the discussions vis-à-vis the scale. Luke's experience on the national pathways. So these are all very, very valuable contributions for the discussion that we are now to have. And I hope you forgive me for calling it like that, but who's better placed to be hearing from than directly from the horse's mouth? We have the special honor to have the deputy, the special envoy of the Secretary General from the Youth Food System Summit with us. Martin, I hope you're already in the line so that you can actually, the mini task that I've sketched out, that you can now relate to these very rich discussion that we had. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much for taking the time. I suppose you would have also other things to do and other commitments. So thank you very much, really, for being here with us. The floor is yours, 5 minutes on your take of what you heard. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much. I just out of another meeting, and the tenor of the other meeting was how far can you push an envelope? And I have been with the international system, I would say, as a national diplomat with the United Nations in different functions since roughly 25 years. And in this 25 years, what you see is an ever-increasing participation of civil society, of indigenous peoples. I have worked on the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, people with disabilities, all sorts of societal groups coming stronger and stronger in the UN. And the UN can only, in my view, be relevant in the 21st century if we are managing to get this vertical integration and the horizontal integration, which is absolutely central for everything in food system transformation. Now, the United Nations are still in the hands of sovereign member states, and they give us a very clear red line when it's coming to anything that is being perceived as setting norms top down, because countries are insisting on their sovereignty. And they do not want anyone to tell them what to do. So in designing of the summit, it was clear that there are two possibilities. One is a negotiation around a binding outcome. And in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, you see how long a process that is and how difficult and just impossible it was in Copenhagen to continue in a top-down logic. So we were looking into an innovative way of doing that, which we were basically by bringing the Food System Summit to countries and saying, we invite you to have these multi-stakeholder conversations to involve not only all of your government, but all of society. And we set standards for that. We were encouraging governments to invite and have participating all walks of their respective societies. So we are not naive, and we knew that in some countries this will simply not be the case. So we built also a balance to that by giving everyone the possibility to host independent food system summit dialogues. And we had now more than 800 of these food system summit dialogues in which different dissenting voices are being expressed and being brought in. The result of this is something you can see online, and it's just went online over the last 2 days. It's by now 57 countries, so a bit more than a quarter of the UN membership that has already published food system transformation pathways, which are available online. You can check them on summitdialogues.org. And we are expecting a very substantial number of additional countries providing food systems pathways at the summit next week on Thursday. Then there's the UN system, which is committed now to work on 4 areas of action, which are quite similar to our action areas, with the one exception that nourishing people, the first action area, is sort of a merge of action track 1 and 2. And there is an action area on means of implementation, finance, governments, human rights, and so on. So you will hear from these action areas at the summit on Thursday. One bit, for example, being that the Green Climate Fund will be announcing a revision of their investment guidelines, being more open to food system related projects and answering to the systemic nature of food systems. And then there are all the coalitions which are emerging out of the action track process, which will continue to exist and which are currently being uploaded on the foodsystems.community site, with a lot of interest from many of the countries who have been working on pathways in order to connect to an international framework. So in other words, it was basically, and it continues to be, a mix of encouraging national level action and work and providing international support, particularly to least developed countries via the resident coordinator system and a coordinated approach of the Rome-based agencies, including UNEP, because UNEP was the coordinator for our task force, plus a whole infrastructure, a whole biotope, I would say, of multi-stakeholder coalitions that are there to support countries in their transformation. And of course, we hope that this will accelerate the necessary changes in food systems, and we are currently discussing a moment in 2023, maybe around the high-level political forum, to look back and say, did that work? You know, what did we learn? What do we need to improve? So Jess, let me stop at this point, and I'm happy to enter into a discussion with you.
Thank you, Martin. And I hope you will have the time to stay on really for the discussion. I'd like to give now the floor to Lindiwe Sibanda, who is the director of the ARUA Centre for Excellence in Sustainable Food Systems, as Lindiwe has actually participated in the discussions of the AGRA Forum on what are the African priorities for the Food System Summit. So I think I'd rather immediately hand over to you, Lindiwe, before I waste more time with speaking about something that I don't know. It's nice to have you with us, Lindiwe. A warm welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to share. I did participate in the African Green Revolution Forum, which was convened just a week ago. This was hosted by His Excellency Uhuru Kenyatta, the head of state for Kenya, and we were able to bring together 8,553 participants from 99 countries who virtually attended, but also face-to-face, as this was a blended event. This was a 5-day conference with day 0 starting with partners. Over 40 partners all over the world came in to showcase their work in what they're doing on sustainable food systems. Then Tuesday to Friday were thematic days, and the overall theme for the conference was Pathways to Recovery and Resilient Food Systems. That's a draw card for everybody because it's about pathways to recovery, but it's also talking to resilient food systems. Now, what came out clear is that there are some fundamentals that need to be addressed. Number one, it's about equitable livelihoods and living incomes. Unless we address SDG number 1, which is eradicating poverty, all the others will fall out, because there are people who've been left behind, and they can be picked up if we address the issue of equitable livelihoods. Second focus was on nutritious diets and a healthy planet, healthy diets for a healthy planet. One thing that was clear is that there are people who cannot afford what we call a healthy diet. We are damaging the planet, but some are doing it not out of choice, but out of ignorance, but also out of limited choices. So we need an African lens which looks at what are the healthy dietary sources that can bring diversity to our plate, but at the same time speak to affordability and speak to the different age groups. So that was a session and a theme dedicated to a whole day. We also had a day that we looked at the sustainable food systems in their totality. They were able to bring ministers from over 60 countries and 5 heads of state and former heads of state, 4 of them, who came into dialogue on what is the conducive environment, what should we be doing in terms of trade, what should we be doing in terms of sustainable food systems. And what was interesting in those dialogues is that we were able to bring the regional representatives of the conveners of the food systems dialogues, both at national and regional level, who were able to collate and curate messages that came bottom up. And they were then shared at this forum so that countries could learn from each other, and also as a pre-summit before we go to UN New York, be able to know what is the Africa position, and the African Union played that leadership role of then curating the message, which was the Africa message for the summit. We then had some interesting sessions with the youth, engaging with President Uhuru, where youth were in a town hall, were able to ask questions, because one of the key things for Africa is the demographic dividend and the opportunity of bringing our youth not just to farming, as was the old narrative when we spoke about agriculture, but when we now talk food systems, we are saying from the farm to the fork, what are the opportunities for the youth? Can we educate them about the opportunities throughout that cycle? And can we avail conducive policies that will allow the youth to be leaders in the food system through the different pathways within the food system? We then had an interesting deal room where different governments were able to pitch in terms of businesses where they want partnerships. We had about 4,500 registered participants for the African Deal Room, where 89 countries were represented and 14 government investment pitches were made and 19 knowledge sessions were convened. A total of 5.1 billion investments were sought by the different governments and SMEs who participated, and 346 million value of investments were sought specifically by small and medium enterprises. All this, for me, was testimony that Africa needs a platform where we can rally and share experiences, but most important, collate our voices so that we learn from each other, but more important, when we go to global platforms, we can speak with one voice. Now, coming to what spoke to me as a participant and also an active player, I think some of the things that we have dropped along the wayside and we need to pick up are, number one, for me, the issue of healthy diets and healthy planet. That narrative has to start right from our school feeding programs, but also the production of the food and also what we do with the food loss and waste. So it's the whole cycle of what we produce. The narrative was always green revolution is about more, but now we need a rainbow revolution, which talks about diversity in our diets, but most important, reducing food loss and waste. And for Africa, we've always thought that there is no waste, but we do have losses at farm level, but we also have a lot of waste because particularly we don't have an effective cooling chain, the cold chain at the farm gate and at household level. But with the hope of renewable energy being made affordable and accessible, there are opportunities. The second one that I want to talk about that came out clear was the living income, that as employers, but also as people also who are self-employed, let's make sure that we set standards that allow the employees to deal with that SDG number 1, and we eradicate poverty. Then my final one, which was exciting to me, was the narrative on regenerative food systems. I think for a long time we've talked sustainable food systems, whereby we talk about start by conserving what you have, restoring, but most important, let's take it full cycle, take it to the people, put people at the center, and talk regeneration. Then that way, we are not only restoring what we have damaged, but we are building back better. So those were the main messages and takeaways for me from the African Green Revolution 2021 Forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindiwe, and I hope that also you will find the time to participate in our discussion that follows. And I like the Rainbow Revolution being based in Pretoria, in the Rainbow Nation, having a Rainbow Revolution.
It's a different rainbow. This is a food one.
Now, I must say that I'm particularly grateful when you look at the lineup that we have managed to put together for this event. And if you followed the discussions on the Food System Summit, you knew that there are, or you know that there are some divergent views on how the Food System Summit was constituted and how it's being led. Now, sort of looking forward, and I think this is how I understood also the first segment, the question really is, from those concerns that were voiced, what is it that we take on for these national transformation pathways? And something that I will then flag later on in response to Martin's point that countries don't like being told. What's the role of the multilateral system if a government doesn't want to be told? The questions of what is the particular role of the Food System Summit and the follow-up to the Food System Summit then. But I leave this for later. This was just a heads up for everybody that I will return to this question. Now, speaking of divergent views on the discussions and the process of the Food System Summit, I'm very happy that Miljan has agreed to join us. He has an equally hectic agenda as Martin has, because as you are aware, there's a lot of discussions going on what are maybe different perspectives on the Food System Summit and how to bring them to the fore. I'm very happy that Miljan has agreed to share his perspective in this group of speakers. Miljan, thank you very much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, TMG. We're very happy that we are invited here, and I'm so happy to see also my friend Martin there. Sidwe, I think we've met with Sidwe, and last week, before last week, I was invited by Her Excellency Agnes Kalibata to participate in one of the sessions in the Alliance for Green Revolution Forum. But we have discussed it internally, and we said that we are not going to participate. Because we don't agree with the Green Revolution agenda totally. It's not good for our people, it's not good for our environment, it's not good for our future. It's a disastrous path to Africa, to African people. So that's what we believe, and I'm not here to comment on what Sidwe said, so I'm not going to go into that, but I know that the African Union has submitted what they call a negotiated proposal for the future of African food system to the UNFSS, and we have produced a statement, also a silent statement against that, because to begin with, it was not as consultative as it said. African I mean, we know what happened at the country level in most of the cases. A country level consultation was not there to a larger extent. And in terms of problem analysis also, there are some problems that it didn't mention. You know, the corporatization of African agriculture, for example, and the Green Revolution agenda, for example. And there was not even mention of agroecology in that statement. So, and in the human rights, you know, at the center of the food system is also human rights. So there is no mention of human rights, the right to food as a very critical issue there. So even the solution is much more based on productivity, technology, competitiveness, you know, these kind of things. It's to begin with, I just wanted to say that the UNFSS was a huge opportunity for everyone. It has raised the agenda of food system to higher level. The country level dialogues would have been used really so much greatly. I think it's an opportunity, not 100% lost, but hugely lost. I think we have agreed with Martin at some point that there was some mistake when it was started in the beginning, because it didn't start through the participation of the civil society. But I think just to use my time to put some concern was in terms of participation, as is evident from the sign-on letter by the larger group of civil society. I think the time that we requested to participate was not right. And I'm also part of the in the international panel of experts on the sustainability of food, as 270 independent scientists, the high-level panel of experts on the sustainability of food, and the global governance experts in the CESOs are hugely concerned by the way science is treated in the conference, you know, in the UNFSS. And there is even an agenda to create an institution which looks like the IPCC, and that we oppose hugely, mainly because we already have the, as you know, Martin, the high level of panels of experts, you know, which was very democratic, very participatory, already more than 10 years of experience in working. So that was very sad, and the knowledge of indigenous people, the knowledge of local communities, not included in the science group of the UNFSS, and even the composition, the majority of them are natural scientists and about 8 economists. There was no social scientists there, so the whole reorientation of the science body is very much questionable. UNFSS missing is a critical look into the corporate power in our food system. We know that very few companies, about 5 of them, control over 60% of the world seeds. In the same is true on artificial fertilization and also pesticides. So the food system is controlled by a few. The whole UNFSS is a real critic of the corporate ownership of the corporate. What do you call it? The corporatization of the food system is not discussed. Even then, much more dangerously, there is this thing called stakeholderism, which would put big corporations alongside weaker actors like local communities or local governments. And that whole arrangement of stakeholderism, as you know, Martin, is hugely criticized. And food system dialogues were really an opportunity. And I know some of them, where they were taken, how they happened at the country level, because we are doing our own dialogues in 24 African countries. We are wrapping up. We have started it before even UNFSS, these food system dialogues, food policy dialogues in 24 African countries. And we know what kind of dialogues were happening at the country level. We were happy that the system agenda was high up even at some countries level, but the way they were conducted was very much questionable. And look at now that the AU even said that the statement that was produced is based on this country level dialogue. So that's very much problematic. And finally, I think the human rights agenda should be, the right to food agenda should be at the center of it. I know, during the pre-summit, agroecology was included in some quarters, but in the African Union, it is not there. It's just a struggle continuing. So thank you very much. Sorry for my disorganized presentation. I was taken off my feet by the report on AGRF. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Million. And as I said earlier, the passion shows really. And now seriously speaking, I think what all the panelists can probably surely agree on, that what the summit needs to deliver on is on the right to food. And I think we will move to that in the next step when we move towards the discussion. But last but not least, I have the pleasure of inviting Ravi Prabhu, who's the Director of Innovation, Impact and Investment. And Ravi, we have both a joint friend and a joint boss, which is Alexander. And I think if I sort of would probably listen to Alexander, you probably say, yes, you have given yourself the perfect task of coming up with a hyper-complex narrative, and now you've figured out how to resolve that. So I'm very happy to be able to count on you and helping me out on what to do with this complex strand of arguments that we have created here. Ravi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yes, and thank you, Wangu, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. As you can see, I'm as lost as any of you in the forest, surrounded by the bush. So what you hear from me will be probably more confusion than anything else. Let me start by saying just how much I appreciated the interventions that Mutoni and Nomonde made in the previous session. I was really struck by the wisdom that they offered. So you've given me a very complex question to answer. There's key words in it: nature-based solutions, in being inclusive, being a shared imperative, etc. I'm going to offer what I think could be a framing that helps us. One, a landscape framing. So what do I mean by landscape? Well, what I mean is we've got to start bringing three things together and immediately: people, the land or nature from which they live, and the whole issue of diversity. That we start understanding diversity, whether it's social or biophysical, as a key source of resilience. If we bring those three things together, then we also need to, and this is why I appreciated what Mutoni and Nomonde were saying earlier, we need to address issues of power and above all, capacity for innovation. I was reminded, listening to really great interventions today, of the aphorism that even if the problems are global, all solutions are local. And today's solutions are often tomorrow's problems. And Million and Lindiwe, hi Lindiwe, long time. The Green Revolution in my country is the source of most problems in the country today. And I'm part of groups thinking through how we get beyond the Green Revolution. So how we frame our approaches, how we situate ourselves within those approaches, how we empower those whose solutions, whose innovation is going to matter, is the key challenge that I would have put to some of our colleagues who are managing policy. And Martin, in the absence of those, I'll put those gorillas on your shoulder. But, to the colleagues in GIZ and BMZ, I think the time has passed for us to think of a global solution as being truly global. We have to think in terms of empowering the people who are faced with the challenges of producing food, managing value chains around food, with the capacity to innovate and develop things that are adaptive and well adapted. And that's where I heard a lot of wisdom from both Muthoni and Nomonde in the earlier session. In our research, we come across this over and over again. And there is a little bit of a seduction of the incredible power of modern science, be it biotechnology, be it digital, be it political science, that big science will solve all problems, including small problems. And that's not true. I think we have to understand that we need multiple partnerships. And I think it was earlier in the day that Fatima spoke about partnerships that are on an equivalent basis. And I would bring that to the question of my community, the research for and research in development community, that we have to be much more humble about where innovation is going to come from. It is often the farmers. And our capacity to support the farmers in their innovation has to improve. We cannot look for continental solutions or global solutions or even country solutions without those who are innovating being capable of finding the solutions for themselves and applying them to their unique contexts. So this is the landscape approach, which is a nested scale approach. And within this landscape approach, I would want to situate concepts of stewardship, the duty of care, not just for the commodification of nature, but for the ability of nature to deliver us the services that allow us to look into the future and look into it with hope. My last thought here was the first thought I had this morning. I was invited several weeks ago to speak to children between the ages of 8 and 10 about forests, climate change, etc. And being a scientist, I probably talked over their heads. Today I heard back from them. And in song, in poetry, in art, in PowerPoint presentations, they enriched my life in a way, whether they were talking about butterflies or tigers, or whether they were talking about forest fires, or whether they were talking about food from the forest. Insights that were really important. And what struck me is this is the generation that is going to have to take out the shovels and, pardon my English, remove the dung that we have put on Earth. And I do hope, Martin, next Thursday or Friday, the day after the conference, that all of us, including Million, we can look to the conference and say that really helped us. But regardless of what happens at the UNFSS, I think it's incumbent on all of us to start finding the solutions. And I thank my hosts and the Robert Bosch Foundation for hosting this event so that we can start thinking about this. Yes, Wangu, back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi. And I think I would like to allow the panel to respond, and I would like to ask my directors to please have everyone on the screen. And I think in discussing, I think there's probably a lot of discussion that could be had on milk already spilled, but I think I would rather, following Ravi's line of thinking, really invite comments that would lead us towards the question of how do these national level processes that are to follow, how are they to contribute to delivering on the right or progressive realization of the right to food, and the question on if the problems are global, therefore we have a multilateral system, so what do we expect the multilateral system now to deliver? I know that these are not easy questions, and I know it's an impossible task to respond to them now, but I would like to really give each of you the opportunity to respond to those. And I'll start with Martin, and then we go on. Martin, over to you.
Well, thanks very much. And excellent comments. Try to come to a couple of those. It has been said a million times that the UN can only be as good as their member states. I have been in a previous life a negotiator for the UN Human Rights Council, for example. And in that Human Rights Council, after an incredible fight, you have all the instruments you will ever need to really realize human rights, but it doesn't help you if the member state is blocking you. So in everything that we are doing with the Food Systems Summit, mind that in the end there is a set of ambassadors who will pull you by the ears if you go further than they allow you to. And, you know, sometimes I need to address a bit of an understandable but slightly childish impression that I'm not happy with my government and now the United Nations will come in and really tell them what to do. This is not how it works. But in recognition of that, you know, this is precisely why we have built this deeply decentralized process. And it resonates, Rabi, with what you said on landscapes, because we want to enable the transformation in countries. Now, nations are still too big because nations are much bigger than landscapes. But in many cases, we had even small countries like Nepal, for example, doing 14 Food System Summit dialogues really to go into the landscapes. I have heard during the process also the concept of foodscapes, which I find also very interesting if you think about cities and where their food is coming from. I think the biggest challenge in participation is, and you know, I open a bracket here, the number one outcome of this summit will be that you will be hearing on the top of the mountain the central importance of food system, of the right to food. And you will be hearing that, and that's not surprising as an SDG summit, that leaving no one behind starts with empowering all of those who are most left behind. You know, I want to push back there at this point at one criticism that the civil society would be opposed against the summit. This is just nonsense, because the civil society is a broad range of actors. And this is the first food system or the first UN summit that you ever had in which the action tracks or the negotiation streams, or however you want to call it, are actually all led by civil society actors. There is one part of civil society which is unhappy about it, and that's the civil society mechanism of the CFS. And there was a lack of communication at the outset, while this summit, other than other summits, was not organized out of Rome and out of the Committee for Food Security, but really was elevated to be an SDG summit based in New York. And, you know, this is to pay tribute to all 17 SDGs, including the right of food, but not limited to. There is also the right to a healthy environment, the right to health, all of these, all 17 SDGs. And, you know, I have personally appealed quite often to the CSM to help us go to the smallholder farmers, improve their participation. And you can always do better. You know, if I would start the process today, we would do it differently. But sometimes it felt a little bit like a catch-22 when you say, well, help us getting the smallholders, the landless, the peasants, the workers in the system, so we can hear from them. And then the reply is, no, we are not talking to you because you don't have the landless, the peasants, the workers participating. So this was a bit of an unhappy loop. Agroecology is more than one area we have been speaking about. Joao, who has been leading this action track, called it a center of gravity for food systems transformation. There is not only a coalition coming out, all 5 action tracks worked very intensively on agroecology, not only for environmental reasons, but also as an instrument to empowering communities, to build resilience, to build livelihoods, and to fight poverty. Now, what can we do with the countries moving forward? Yes, was your question. I think we have set the standard for an all-of-society participation in transforming the food system, and that only just started. I mentioned, and I was actually wrong, by now we have 68 countries, I just cross-checked, who have uploaded their food systems pathway. I can only invite everybody, particularly NGOs, indigenous women's groups, and so on, to take their governments by the word, to push for your participation, to listen very carefully what your head of state is saying next Thursday, and take that as a reason to continue pushing. So at the other side, what can a multilateral body do? Well, there's the whole UN system, which is supporting countries. There's the World Bank, there's the investments there. There's the Green Climate Fund, where you will see a change in the investment structure. So we can accompany as much as possible this national transformation and set a North Star, which will be the statement of action of the Secretary General on Thursday. And that's my last sentence, because this statement of action is not only built out of the results of national dialogues, which, by the way, are all convened by the national governments, not by the UN, by national governments. But this statement of action also takes into consideration the independent dialogues, what we have heard from our youth groups, from indigenous, from all stakeholder groups. But in the end, this statement of action, like anything the UN does, also needs to enjoy the support of the membership of the United Nations. And that is just the system in which you are working when the basis of what you are doing are sovereign nation states. So Jess, back to you. I hope that helped clarifying, but I'm also happy to answer more questions.
Thank you, Martin. And I think I would like to, sort of building on what you just said, hand it over to Linda and ask sort of, if you advise, sort of, you work a lot with governments and with decision takers, what is it that you can take from these discussions regarding the future design of the continuation of these national dialogues?
Thank you very much. I hope I won't make Million dizzy after I've spoken ahead of him. And Million, you are aware that I don't work for AGRA, I work with a university entity. But all my life, I've always believed in the multi-stakeholder dialogues. Why that is important is because this is the platform where you engage, where you seek diversity, but you come up with a position that is informed. So for me, what I like about the AGRF, the African Green Revolution Forum, with an emphasis on the F being an African forum, is that it was able to bring over 8,000 participants to dialogue and to have divergent views. So what do I take out of this? I very much like the approach that was taken. It's the first time within the UN system that the issue of dialogues is elevated. But I think we need some education on how best. I know David Nabarro and his team did a good job in trying to curate a process that is people-driven. But, you know, most of this starts with inclusivity. Who is around the table? Number two, it's a power issue. Who is the moderator and convener of that dialogue? And where I come from with my culture, there are certain people who will not be able to talk when there is somebody superior or senior to them. So we've seen how the ship is going. We have learned, but let's not make this the end all for food systems dialogues. Let's continue to use the methodology, sharpen it, customize it to our cultural, oral African culture, and bring those voices through drama, as Ravi said, through poetry, through our own traditional means of communicating those topics that are difficult to communicate. And only then will we be able to domesticate and customize what our head of state will say in New York, but then hold them to account on the ground when they come back and say, sir, you said, but we believe this is, because for me, you can talk, the implementer has more power than the policymaker. So civil society should be rallied to implement the way they believe is best for them. and then ride on the position taken by the country and hold policymakers to account. That's what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. And by mentioning the term accountability, I think you're mentioning a key term that is, in my understanding at least, fundamental when we speak about the progressive realization of the right to food. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Million. Million, one of our viewers has asked, what are the chances that we, meaning the agroecology community, are not at the table? What are the chances that we will be on the plate? And so my question to you would be, if we are to design these national level multi-stakeholder processes in a way that has been described for accountability, what are your requests how these should be led that was missing before? And I fear you're muted.
Now? Yes. I'm quite shocked with what Martina said, to be honest. I usually hate in meetings to really have a personal spar, but CSM is not, a sideways, say so. African civil society, including farmers, fisher folks, indigenous peoples, consumer groups, women groups, youth groups, have rejected the way that you're doing things, so only CSM. The right to food, Michael Fakhari, Michael Fakhari, the special rapporteur to the right to food, has criticized hugely the UNFSS, and he said that the right to food is not integrated in the right way. Maybe you have invited him at the latter stage. So anyway, I just don't want to go to that. The country level, we have started it, as I said before, even the UNFSS was convened and conceived. The Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa is organizing or has started organizing country level food policy processes in 24 African countries: North, South, East, West, both Anglophone and Francophone, and Central Africa and the Congo Basin area. So what we are trying to do is bringing all actors together. There's no one left there. All actors together, they just invite the participants. And the question is, at the country level, at the national level, what kind of food system should we have to have a sustainable and healthy diet? That's the question. And are the policies in the country, as they are existing now, coherent? Do they lead us to a good food system? That's the question that they ask themselves. What do the policies lack? Do they reflect the current level of innovativeness in the community, in the market even? So they ask this question and they are finalizing their report. And at the African Union level also, we are working with African Union to develop a food policy. Next week there will be a discussion on a report that has come out of an analysis of the African food system landscape. So we are engaging. We are not sitting aside and criticizing. We are engaging. We need to engage. We need to have a better food system. We need to engage with all the actors, because food at the end of the day is everybody's concern, So that's what we are doing, and that's what we will continue to do. Thank you very much.
Ravi, the last words on this session before I hand over to Violet and Alexander to provide their reading of the debate are with you.
Oh, well, in that case, everything is in good hands. No, look, I think whatever happens at the UN Food System Summit, is going to happen. It's already too late. I'm reminded, actually it was Alexander who reminded me a few weeks ago that next year is the UNCED plus 50, and when you reflect on that and all of the other global meetings that we've had, how much have we achieved there? It's been a great way of bringing people together. People have gone away happy or unhappy. But the real question is the engagement, the at country and at subnational level of people who are concerned about what future do they want for themselves and their children. So, let's put the UN Food System Summit in that perspective. I think by Friday next week, we'll already be looking beyond it. And I think the questions that Million, you, Martin, Lindiwe have asked will remain. Not just the food system. I think, the problem I have is that we are always reductionists. While clearly there is a right to food, I also would say there's a right to nutrition, which we lost sight of in the first Green Revolution. We're also got a right to survival and, in fact, to thriving on this planet. So unless we bring the food system into the larger perspective of what we want from nature, from our society, issues of power, etc., etc. So that's an ongoing conversation. So all I could say is that, it's no use all of us throwing verbal brickbats at each other. This is the community that needs to go out and continue to do the work it's doing. Speaking for my small organization, we would really be happy to be working with any and all of you. And this is my last word, let's bring the proof, let's bring the evidence in the landscapes and to the lives, not in the conference rooms, not on the negotiation tables. We've never got anywhere really far, and I speak from sort of my own bruises in this context. But let's get out there and work with the people who are actually going to find the solutions, the farmers, the traders, the value chain and supply chain actors, the people in those landscapes. And let's find solutions that work for them and be aware that we who have access to resources and powers need to be much more responsible with the way we deal with them. Back to you, Yes and Wangu.
Thank you, Ravi. And I think this is really a key point for further consideration then obviously on the role of science in these processes. This is a sort of a separate discussion to the question on the national level dialogues. I'm not the one to respond to this question that you have raised, but I'm very happy to hand over to Wangu, as we have Violet, who is farming, who should to whom the Food System Summit should serve, similar as to Nomonde, to actually have a dialogue with Alexander and Wangu on drawing some initial conclusions from this debate. I would like to thank you, Martin, Million, Lindiwe, and Ravi, for taking the time to share your views in a panel that was sort of programmed to have some conflicting ideas on what should be happening. And I'm very happy that you made yourself available to that end, acknowledging your extremely busy schedule. So thank you very much also for that. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Wangu, Alexander, and Violet.
Thank you. Thank you, Yes. And we're really, really happy to Violet Shibutse and Alexander Muller to join us for this final round, where we try and make sense of everything that's going on. And I think it's not an easy task, but we're really, really grateful that you can join us for this. To introduce you very briefly, Violet Shibutse is the founder of the Shibuya Community Health Workers in Kenya, in Western Kenya, where they have really tried to bring together this notion of healthy diet, to really make meaning for women, widows who are landless, who have been, widowed because their husbands died, and they were left to take care of their families. And so from that very, very basic, need of really feeding their families, they moved on to what are the governance issues needed, and then how can we bring this to the higher table to ensure that we create also structures at the local level that work. And then Alexander Muller, who is my boss, who is the managing director of TMG Think Tank for Sustainability, will then hopefully help us to make broader meaning, as we've been challenged in the previous session, to really, where do we start? What does this mean moving forward? So I'm going to start with you, Violet. You've worked at the grassroots level. You're a community organizer. You're a women's rights advocate, but you also work at the global level. So from your reading, from your listening to these discussions, where we've really been hearing about the disconnect between local and global, where do your own perspectives in terms of how you work and how you try to bridge those two levels, what can you inform us, what can you tell us about how we can make meaning from this very big discussion and where there's so much language that has to be processed? What would you advise? How do we simplify this so that it makes meaning for those on the ground especially? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wangu, and thank you, everyone. I hope I'm being heard because my network has been fluctuating, but I think it's stable now. So what I want to say is that I listened to the previous panel before this, and then I've just listened to this one. And as Wangu says, I am a community organizer who began as a caregiver, and one of my greatest responsibility was to ensure that families that were affected with HIV/AIDS were able to get food, and not just food, but nutritious food. And that's how my journey in development began. And I saw how this really related to how families or marginalized families like those living with HIV/AIDS, who most of them were widows, how they access land, and also even the linkage on how when they access land, how they are trained, or linkages that they make with the agricultural extension officers to be able to utilize this land to produce nutritious food for the families. And even going further, in rural communities, we live on agriculture. So you don't just reach at food at your table, but also to the other families where they pay small money, then agriculture becomes a livelihood for most of the families. So this is my perspective as I listen to this discussion. I think it is important that these kind of convenings, like the ones that we have mentioned, how communities are, first of all, building the basis of the discussions that are going to be discussed in these meetings, being included, because we are talking about inclusivity. This word that has been used always on leaving no one behind or prioritizing the one left more behind. I think it's a very good concept, but it's not actually being implemented or being exercised. It's just being said. So bringing communities together to articulate and understand that we are going to have this forum on food, that the community and food systems, the community which is the main pillar in food systems as producers, being able to engage from a point of view, not just turning up for this event, but like, for example, if I use the Kenyan model, our communities are organized. You heard that I'm a community organizer. The farmers are organized in groups. They are organized in cooperatives. Has there been any way how these farmers are actually brought on board to articulate and understand the forum that is going to be held and be able to prioritize the sessions they would want to participate in, be able to shape the agenda that is going to be discussed, so that when we adopt as partnerships, because we are talking about partnership, and always in my global movement, I've been looking at what do we call as meaningful partnership. And I don't have a lot of time, but I would have shown how meaningful partnership looks like, working with community looks like, in a model like we are saying developing new other models like how we work with TMG, where the communities are prioritizing the issues they want to work in. The community are the ones doing the consultations. The communities are the ones then bringing the agenda or shaping the narrative of the agenda. I think this is what I have seen actually missing. We actually it would be very important if we think about how to bring community at the center to make their priorities, to be able to influence the discussions in such a meeting, and then how these discussions then trickle back again to the community, because not everyone is attending this meeting. If I would not have been in this meeting today, I wouldn't have known that we had this forum on food systems. No, because the communities, no one takes this information back to the community. So in my perspective, I think there should be really a deliberate effort on how to ensure that the pillar of food systems, which is community, is included in a more meaningful way, and they're the ones that are driving the agenda and forming the narrative. Because a case has already been proven on how much contribution the communities are doing in food system strengthening, in being able to produce, in being able to develop initiatives, innovations that even respond to negative implications of climate change that affect food security. That has been proven, and everyone has actually understands the power of community. But now bringing these voices to the table of discussion is still a big barrier that will not be able to make us realize the sustainable development goals. I think for now I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Violet. And thank you for reminding us, just how complex this is. And I think I'm going to throw that right back at Alexander and just ask, can you help us? Is there any way that we can, frame this in a way that it makes sense for the different actors that are at the table, these multiple actors that all look at it from their own perspective? Is there any sort of frame, as we have been challenged, that we can use to maybe make meaning of this, especially as we move from the global to the national and the local?
Thanks a lot, Wangu, for this more than challenging question. Let me try to start with referring to the title of this meeting. It's a dialogue between Europe and Africa. And the dialogue is characterized by talking, but also by listening. And I would like to start with what I have heard, especially from the participants from the different African countries. And you might be surprised, but when our friends and colleagues were talking about the multiple challenges imposed by the climate crisis, when they were talking about the need to produce better and more, when community kitchens have been presented as the place where people could meet, could feed themselves, but also these kitchens can be considered being a hub for transformation. I was thinking about, first, what is our responsibility in Europe? And for me, a very, very clear message came out. The struggle the African countries in the different parts of this huge continent, the struggles they will have to meet are very much linked to our behavior. If we do not reduce our CO2 emissions drastically, the space for you to adapt will be much smaller, the challenges will be a lot bigger, and the need to support development will be even bigger. And therefore, Wangu, you might be surprised. The first lesson I have again learned, and I think we have to say it very loud and very often, is that Europe and the global north has a special responsibility in reducing our own environmental footprint in order to give enough space, for example, for the different approaches in Africa to adapt to the change in climate. This is also part for me of the dialogue. The second message I was hearing is, in order to tackle the multiple crises, climate change, hunger, Gerrit Hansson in the beginning mentioned loss of biodiversity. We could also have added water. Ravi Prabhu was referring to it. In order to tackle this multiple crisis, we have to carefully consider that every dollar invested will generate multiple benefits. And it is very clear for me, again, that achieving multiple benefits can only happen at the landscape level. But by the way, it's not happening in conferences. Farmers on the ground will have to deal with it, but in order to make this world more sustainable and following the 17 SDGs, we have to act at the landscape level. Making a farm sustainable is a necessary step, but it is not sufficient. Unless we manage landscapes, watersheds differently, we will not go towards what we want to achieve. And here, this is my third item, the Food System Summit plays a really important role. I would like to make two comments on it. First of all, congratulations, Martin, for having achieved that 68 or hopefully soon 80 national transformation pathways are going to happen. This is an important step forward. But now, maybe I have to invite you for a bottle of wine after my second comment. I am convinced that sooner or later, the two of us will agree that these national transformation pathways will have identified problems which are too big to be solved by one country only. Even if it's a big country like the United States or it's a smaller country like Nepal. And this is the very nature of the United Nations, to deal with problems that are too big to be tackled or to be solved in one country. And of course, I know it is incredibly difficult to bring countries to agree, for example, on subsidies for agriculture. Between difficult and impossible. But this is what has to be the next step after the national transformation pathways and the national dialogues, to identify what type of overarching governance is needed in order to tackle what countries want to do. Next comment. We have mentioned the right to food several times. Why? I could make it a simple answer. It is a human right. It is agreed by all countries in the world. Why aren't we applying it? But I would like to go beyond. What we currently see in countries like Madagascar because of climate change, what might happen in Afghanistan because of war, is a new threat to food security. And this new threat for food security needs safeguards. And these safeguards can be found in an internationally agreed document, the guidelines for the implementation of the right to food. And why do I come with these guidelines now? I would be very happy, and we can call our friend David Nabarro, who is leading this national transformation pathways, to tell him all these national dialogues should add a chapter on how are we going to implement the right to food in our own country. Full stop. Very simple, so that we provide a safeguard for the necessary transformation. That's my next comment. Let us be honest. Food system transformation is among the most difficult things one can do. Moving in the energy system from the fossil fuel-based supply of energy, oil, gas, coal, to renewable energies is complex. It has far-reaching implications. You need new technologies, you need new governance, but it is simple if you compare it to food system transformations. One of the speakers mentioned it, that in bigger towns, in urban areas in Africa, you have 60 to 80% informal markets for food supply. You have very close relations between informal vendors, producers of food in urban and peri-urban areas and in the rural areas. Looking at a transformation towards sustainability in these multiple systems requires action on the ground, but, and this is an issue which came to my mind during the whole day, it should also look at, is the economic foundation of how we are assessing food systems the right one? One could refer to a nice sentence of one of the presidents of the United States who said, it's the economy, stupid. As long as food can be produced while externalizing negative impacts on the environment in a way that seems to be cheap, farmers have a problem, consumers have a problem, and therefore I'm coming back to the question, do we need for food system transformation a different type of economic analysis? And we know that the United Nations have made big steps forward in the Statistical Commission. We know that many countries are working on it. And therefore, I really think in a dialogue between Europe and Africa, we should also look at, is the way we are valuing our food and we are exporting it and we are bringing it to supermarkets in Africa, is this the right way? Or should we also look at the damage done to rural communities because we export our food? Should we go beyond the narrow economic approach, and should we look at all impacts of food production in a positive and in a negative way? And therefore, I don't know, Wangu, if I have another minute, I really think that this debate, where we have on purpose invited people from different perspectives, from different continents, requires some more additional steps. Can we agree on a process where we are looking at the progress made in the next 2 years? Martin, you've mentioned it. There will be kind of a monitoring of these national food system dialogues. But can we also continue in a very open and frank way to look at what is missing? Where are we maybe going not fast enough? Fatima mentioned in the beginning, it's about the speed. It's about allowing people to develop their own ideas. It's about the question of, are there differences between a European and the African approach? And can we continue to identify critical points? And that's my last sentence. If we don't manage to bring in the challenges created by climate change into this food system debate, it will be close to impossible to go towards what we want to do. We are currently on a pathway towards 3.2 degrees on average in the world. This means for Kenya, maybe plus 5 degrees. If we don't act fast here in Europe, the space for the African countries to adapt and to react will be shrinking year by year. And therefore, identifying critical points which have to be included in this debate, in all controversial discussions we can have, I think is an important topic forward. I have learned, and I stop with my first sentence, that if we want to continue this dialogue next time, and we have another meeting on, I think, the 16th of October, we should start with what are we going to offer as our action to allow the activities in Africa to really be successful and to allow that the different approaches you have presented can be implemented at the country level. It is more than a dialogue, it has to become a joint action. And my last word is, it's the old definition of common but differentiated responsibilities. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for trying to unpack a really, really rich discussion and really trying to set an agenda for moving forward. And I want to end it simply by giving Africa the last word, if you will allow me, my European friends. And so I'm going to ask Violet. Violet, you started as a health worker. We've heard about the right to healthy and nutritious food, but also to a healthy environment. And now we're moving to the climate change process, which is the next session that we're going to be looking at these issues. What would you advise? Where should we start to sort of look at these two things in a synergistic way, that we look at them together so that we link food to land to climate? So where should we start? What should be the one thing we should focus on when we move on to the climate process?
I think one important thing to focus on is to first look at what are the synergies that are already existing at community level that provide solutions, and I would actually call them sustainable solutions, to addressing the negative implications of climate change in the context of increasing soil fertility, looking at land rights, because land rights is something that kind of disappears in this discussion, and be able to ensure that people can access land. There will be partnership that can be able to scale up the innovations that are already existing. We have seen a lot of blueprint innovations, new technologies that do not actually support these communities at all. But the communities have innovations that are really working, and that just needs partnership that can look at these kind of innovations in a meaningful way and look at them from the context of how do people access land from that community system. Is it cultural, is it traditional, or is it the individual land system or public land, whatever? And then we are able to actually look at how to use those kind of systems to be able to balance how people are how we are actually solving the solution of the climate change. We cannot address this as one in silos. We must address this together. And we already have case studies that we have provided. We have worked with TMG. We are looking at policy. There's been a notion that communities do not understand policy. But I'm telling you, when you look at what communities are doing in consultation with traditional leaders, systems that were in existence but were disrupted because of a lot of borrowing from Western and leaving what the Africans were doing. And I'm not saying the Western systems are bad, but how you balance these systems to ensure that all of them are in consultation and working together to advance development. We actually have these case studies, and we need to look from that kind of context. We do not have
I think, Violet, I think you're okay.
I would say we are not starting from a blank page.
Thank you. I think...
Did I come back? I think it's my network.
Yeah, not to worry, not to worry. I think we have gotten your message loud and clear. Thank you very much, Violet. You know, we appreciate it. We appreciate it for bringing it back to where it matters, to the land, to people being able to grow their food, to having that right to exist and to have a livelihood. So thank you. And I think we are really going to leave it at this. There's so many things we could say to wrap up, but it's impossible to wrap up such a rich discussion. So I'm just going to ask my co-moderator, Yes, to just give a vote of thanks, and we're really just going to leave it at that. No need to add anything. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Wangu. And it's really up to me to say thank you first to all the panelists who have really shared their expertise, insights, and time with us. I'm next to certain we didn't do justice to all your valuable contributions. I apologize for that, but we promise to take this up as we move along. So thank you very much for this. Second, I would like to thank all those who took the time to participate in this online format, which sometimes is challenging, but thank you very much for registering and for watching. We had so far 31 countries in attendance. More figures will be following. And last but not least, I would really like to thank the fabulous colleagues at the Foundation who really made this perfect setup possible and to really organize this meeting in such a swift and extremely kind way. So on these notions of thank, last but not least, as they say, COVID not compliant. Thank you to Wangu, my famous co-facilitator. I wish you all a good remainder of the day and see you next time. 9th of October, we will be reaching out to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and bye-bye, and thank you very much. Bye-bye.